This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A little traveling today, so here comes a mega episode. Author Brian Christian, author Bill Bonner, author Kathleen Eisenhart, and author Emmanuel Derman. Brian Christian, author of Algorithms to Live By, a must-read. Author Bill Bonner, his book, Hormageddon, How Too Much of a Good Thing Leads to Disaster. Kathleen Eisenhart, Simple Rules. You gotta know I love that. Last but not least, Emmanuel Derman, My Life as a Quant. Of course, that is also right in the Mike Covel, that's me, the Mike Covel headspace. No great setup. Let's jump right into this mega episode with four very, very wise people. So this great book came across my desk, Algorithms to Live By, the Computer Science of Human Decisions. Let me give a brief overview from the website. A fascinating exploration of how computer algorithms can be applied to our everyday lives, helping to solve common decision-making problems and illuminate the workings of the human mind. All our lives are constrained by limited space and time, limits that give rise to a particular set of problems. What should we do or leave undone in a day or a lifetime? How much messiness should we accept? What balance of new activities and familiar favorites is the most fulfilling? These may seem like uniquely human quandaries, but they are not. Computers, too, face the same constraints. So computer scientists have been grappling with their version of such problems for decades, and the solutions they've found have much to teach us. Again, that is from the book Algorithms to Live By Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths. And my guest today is one of those authors, Brian Christian. Oh, and by the way, if you invest or if you are a trader, it's a must read. Now on to Brian Christian. How in the world did you even start to go down this path with your co-author? Really?
I've really been going down this path since my teenage years. When I was in college, I was a double major in computer science and philosophy. You know, in some sense, each way of looking at the world started to permeate the other. And I began, thinking of computer science in philosophical terms, but also thinking about computer science as a way to approach the problems that I was facing in everyday life, the way that we would turn to a discipline like philosophy for advice on, the problems of the world, the things that we're grappling with. I actually found that computer science offered me, in many ways, an as compelling or more compelling framework, and really a vocabulary for kind of understanding the problems around me. And so, this is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time.
My background, having written several books on trading, I was just stunned to go through your work because, and I don't know if anyone said this to you yet, but if somebody is a trader, an investor in 2016, and they're serious about it, this is almost foundational, your work. Now, maybe that was not the intent, but in my world, so many of the quant traders, and I'm not talking about the high frequency stuff, but the kind of the longer term trend traders that have 100% automated strategies, all back tested, finding a positive mathematical expectation, understanding overfitting, understanding robustness, having it all automated. And to read your work, it's like, oh, wow, okay, whether intended or not, you guys just laid down the foundation for traders today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, that's not an area that I know especially deeply, but it's certainly, I'm certainly aware that we're kind of living in this time in which a lot of the decision making that's going on in the world, finance being a great example, is increasingly being, executed by algorithms. There's this increasing need to understand just some of the larger ideas and the real principles of the field of computer science as a way of kind of making sense of how these things operate. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring some of those principles back to our own decision-making processes in our own lives. And so that's really where I see this book coming in, is it kind of completes this feedback loop where for the last 50 or 60 years, algorithm designers have begun by asking themselves how they would solve a problem. And that's often, any programmer's first draft of a piece of code that they're writing. But of course, as the field has matured, we've developed this formal rigor around being able to make assertions and make proofs around optimality and expectation and bounds and so forth. What we haven't seen is bringing that knowledge back around to improve our own intuitions. And so that's where I see this book coming in, as kind of completing that circuit.
Let's talk the word algorithm. For people that know, they'll hear your words, they'll read your work, and they'll be like, oh, okay, it makes perfect sense. But for a lot of people, I know the word algorithm immediately brings about fear and confusion. And why don't you give a little of a historical perspective? Because an algorithm is just really a way to take things that we could do as a human being on a piece of paper with a pencil and taking it to the land of computer science, to the land of computers. So why don't you give a little bit of a narrative there? Because it's not necessarily so complicated. I think sometimes it's the vocabulary that causes people to pause.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a word that today we associate specifically with the world of computer science, but the principle of what makes an algorithm is it's really just a series of steps that you follow to solve a problem or make a decision. Algorithms in this sense are much older and much broader than the computer, of course. And we all in school learned, for example, algorithms for doing long division, or you subtract by carrying the one and so forth. But it goes back even farther than that. I mean, you can think of and cooking following a recipe as being algorithmic in that sense. And so mathematical procedures have been found on clay tablets dating back thousands of years. And so in many ways, they are not only older than the computer, but they are some of the first and oldest technology, if you will, of the human race, at least as old as the Stone Age.
So let's bring people into an example. I was thinking of one in my life inspired by your work, and perhaps you can take my example and run with it and pass along the lessons. Years ago, I was working on a documentary film. I had just moved to San Diego. I needed to hire a film assistant. I put a Craigslist ad out. I think approximately 30 female candidates showed up. The very first one was the most competent, but she scared me. I just moved to California. She was in a pantsuit. I don't know. She just scared me, and I didn't want to hire her on the spot. So I interviewed 29 other ladies, and they were just all not anywhere near her level. And then, in fact, the very last candidate, I can't even make this up. I laughed to myself about the very last candidate, as we were leaving, attempted to kiss me on the lips as an exit interview. So I went back and I hired the very first lady. And as it turns out, she ended up going to USC's film school and has a successful career now in LA. So it was a good choice, but I wasn't really using any kind of an algorithm probably described in your work. I was probably doing everything wrong.
Well, you certainly found yourself in one of the canonical problems of the 20th century, which is called the secretary problem. And it is almost exactly as you described. The canonical setup is you're hiring for a position and you get, N candidates. So in your case, 29 or 30 show up in a random order. At each step of the way, you evaluate the next candidate that comes in, and you have to either hire them on the spot and send everyone else away and never know if there might have been a better candidate out there, or you dismiss this candidate, in which case, in the classical version of the problem, you do not get the ability to call them back later and try to bring them back in. The crux of this problem is, how do you try to, of course, hire the very best person for the job without knowing in advance who that person is going to be? And at each step of the way, you're faced with making this irrevocable choice. Do you take the person in front of you and not know what else is out there, or do you send them away, but maybe you've just blown your best opportunity? This field in general is known as optimal stopping. And in the book, we sort of unpack the structure of optimal stopping problems and show that there are really a whole host of situations in life that take this form. And so one of the examples that we give is real estate. If you're looking to buy a house or rent an apartment, in most competitive markets, you are faced with exactly this kind of a dilemma where let's say you go to an open house and people are submitting bids pretty much on the spot. And so you have exactly this dilemma. How do you know when your best opportunity is without the ability to gather information and synthesize it before making a choice? And the classical version of the problem has this very famous solution, which is that you should refrain from making any offers for the first 37% of the applicant pool. And after that point, instantly extend an offer to the first person you see who's better than everyone you saw in the first 37%.
And it's very similar in thinking to something like a mathematical expectation type formula, where you're just saying, okay, you're not trying to say you know the absolute best. You're saying it's the best for right now. Let's make a decision. Let's move on.
I think there's a deeper point here about this problem, which is that even following the optimal solution, it does not guarantee that you're going to get the optimal result every time. What it can offer you is, in this case, the best probability of getting the best outcome. And I think at a slightly deeper level, what it can offer you is really peace of mind. That usually when we make a decision and we don't necessarily get the outcome that we want, the first thing that we do is kind of play back the entire thought process that led to the actions that we took and sort of call into question everything that we did along the way. And there's something, I think, very consoling about having a mathematical or a computational understanding of the form of the problem that you're facing, which is that it enables you to be confident even when you don't get the result that you want. You can still know, hey, I followed the right procedure. I followed the right thought process in this case. Even if I didn't get the outcome I wanted, I don't have to call all of that into doubt because I know that I followed the right process.
Process versus outcome. They're not, I think that's one of the biggest issues we have in humanity today. We can have that great process, but we all still fixate on the outcome, whereas we should be saying to ourselves, let's just follow a great process and know that we're going to have errors, we're going to have mistakes. But if we keep following the good process, we're going to be in a much better place in the long run.
I think that's exactly right. An understanding of the structure of the problem that we're facing, the basic characteristics of the optimal solutions, I think is a really powerful starting point in order to get a sense of what those processes should be.
And I'll give you an example in my world too. When you look at some of the traders today, let's say they have a 100% automated trading system and they'll get a signal that says buy. Well, most of the time, 60% of the time, perhaps that buy signal turns around, goes the other direction, and you have to take a small stop. As a human being, though, if you're just sitting there making the discretionary decision, you call into question, did I make the right move? Did I do the right thing? The computer just says, hey, I'm going to follow the rules. And we know in the long run, we want to get out if it doesn't go our direction. It's very, very similar to what you're outlining in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add also that, there are some people who are skeptical, for example, that the structure of a classic optimal stopping problem really does describe the types of decisions that we face in everyday life. I mean, there is this very strict assumption in the problem that at each moment in time you have this irrevocable choice. And in your case, you encountered a real life example where the assumptions of the model were a little bit relaxed. In the case of making that hire, you were able to go back and extend an offer to someone even if you didn't hire them on the spot. In fact, there are optimal algorithms for this version of the problem too, which is known as recall. Trading, I think, offers a wonderfully stark example where, as you describe, at each moment in time, you have this extremely fleeting and ephemeral opportunity. You must make a decision on the spot. If you buy, then you can't reverse that without some pain, right? But also, if you fail to act, then the opportunity may go away, and you don't have the opportunity to rectify that also. In fact, many aspects of the financial world are implicitly modeled using optimal stopping under the hood. I know that American stock options, for example, if you want to assign a value to the option to buy something or the option to sell something, how do you assign a value to that? Well, implicitly, you have to make some assumptions about whether that person is going to be able to know the correct time, the best time to exercise that option. The mathematics of optimal stopping are at work under the hood of some of these things that are familiar to traders.
As you talk, as you explain, I think back to my MBA program and I say to myself, I thought I really only learned two things of great value in my life: the definition of a sunk cost and an opportunity cost.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's right. It's right there in that, right in the same headspace. Let me let you tear apart another word. You mentioned it earlier, and plenty of people are going to know, but probability is a sticky wicket for people. But let's talk about probability, because again, it's the process versus outcome thing. And it's like whether we're talking poker or the MIT blackjack team, trading, VC financing, probability is really the success foundation of so many businesses today. And I don't think that's necessarily properly understood by so many people that don't have the training or the understanding.
Yeah, I think, furthermore, one of the key things that compounds the problem of dealing in probabilities is we're also dealing in uncertainties. That you might have information about two things, and you're trying to decide between them, but not only is the information probabilistic in nature, it's also uncertain. So to give you a concrete example, let's say there are two airlines that you fly. One of them you fly more than the other. Let's say one of them has been on time 9 out of 15 flights, so 60%. The other one you've only flown twice, and it was on time once, and it was late once, so only 50% performance. Simply put, you're trying to decide what's the smarter airline to take for your next flight. There's one that's been on time 60% of the time, 9 out of 15. The other's been on time 50% of the time, 1 out of 2. But in this case, it's compounded by this other factor, which is that you just don't have as much information about the second airline as you have about the first. How should we try to make the best decision when we're comparing these two different quantities? There's a famous problem in computer science called the multi-armed bandit problem, which is sort of an odd name, but it comes from the idea of the slot machine as the one-armed bandit. And it's exactly this. It's like you walk into a casino, there are all these slot machines that pay out at different rates with different probabilities. But crucially, you don't know which machines pay off at which rates and which are better than others until you start playing them. And I think that's something that's very true in many aspects of life. And so the critical thing to a computer scientist is what's called the explore-exploit trade-off. So you have to very consciously trade off how much energy you're going to spend gathering information and how much of your energy and your time and your money you're going to spend leveraging the information that you've already gained to try to get the best outcome that you can. And I think there are so many situations in life where we have to trade off in exactly this dimension. I mean, careers being one example where, you have people weighing, Is it worth trying to start over in a different career track, or is it worth going back to school to get this additional credential and things like this? Is it worth exploring this new business possibility, or should I just sort of hone and refine the thing that I have? And in fact, mathematicians and computer scientists that have done some of the most important work on the multi-armed bandit problem and the explore-exploit trade-off have done a lot of it for companies that were explicitly trying to decide how to allocate their resources between these more exploratory things and the things that have a known payoff. So one of the best examples was that in the 1970s, the Unilever Corporation, pharmaceutical company, hires this mathematician, John Gittins, and they say, tell us what percentage of our budget we should be spending on R&D for experimental drugs, and what percentage of our budget we should spend, on just marketing for drugs that are already profitable. And so this gives us a formal framework for thinking about what are otherwise kind of apples and oranges types of comparisons.
I love the one expression used in your work, and I could see it as a book title in the future: win, stay, lose, shift.
Yes. So this was one of the very first results that came out in this area. So the multi-armed bandit problem has this really colorful history in the history of mathematics, where for most of the 20th century it was considered unsolvable, not just a difficult problem, but literally unsolvable. And in fact, the Allied mathematicians in Great Britain during World War II joked about dropping the multi-armed bandit problem over Germany as the ultimate instrument of intellectual sabotage. But to the field's own surprise, they started making a series of gradual breakthroughs in the second half of the 20th century, kind of chipping away at the problem. And one of the first was this finding that this very simple algorithm called win, stay, lose, shift was better than just playing at random, which is a very modest result, but it was really the first key stepping stone towards the full solution of the problem. And the basic intuition behind win, stay, lose, shift is just, if something worked, do it again. If you flew the airline and it was on time, fly them again the next time. If you went to a conference and it was profitable or otherwise kind of worthwhile, go again. If you went to a restaurant and you had a good meal there, go back. But the lose shift part of it means that as soon as you don't get a good outcome, try something else. So as soon as your airline is late, then try the competitor the next time.
You can see why I love this, because I'm thinking immediately, again, in investment terms, and I'm thinking ride your winners, cut your losers.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a great example of what is just this wonderfully intuitive and succinct policy that we're actually able to say, with the full rigor of the field, there are some really positive bounds that we can put on this. We can sort of certify that it's a reasonable approach. It's not necessarily the optimal approach, but it's pretty good, and it's extremely easy to implement.
The win-stay part of it is momentum almost. It's kind of like just follow the momentum. You don't necessarily know why. You might not be able to answer the why, but the win-stay, stay with it. And there's a lot of value to that. And that's very counter to human intuition, I believe.
The basic logic, at least if you're thinking about the formal version of the problem, is, if at time t, let's say, it made sense to go with a certain choice, a certain restaurant, a certain airline, you name it. If it already made sense to do that, and then you do it and it pays off, well, it can only make more sense to do it again, because it can only raise your estimate of it paying off in the future.
Let me say for the audience right now too, since I could literally sit here and ask you questions for hours, I'm not going to get you for hours. But even if I talked for hours, I would not even come close to covering 5%, 2%, 1% of what's in this book. This is extremely dense. And so I do highly recommend it to people to jump in. It's just a fantastic foundation. That said, I want to jump around a little on you. And I love one example, one story, and you can keep tying it into where we're going. But you talk about Jeff Bezos, and you talk about Jeff. Jeff is early in life at an investment firm, looking forward in life and then imagining looking backward and thinking about that from an algorithmic standpoint. Why don't you explain that story? I think it's a fantastic way to bring people into your thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff Bezos, of course, we all know him now as the CEO of Amazon, but he started off in investment banking. He was at a very prestigious and successful firm. I believe it was D.E. Shaw, and he was working in New York City, and he has this inkling, as he explains to his boss at the time, that he wants to leave this investment firm and start an online bookstore in Seattle, which at the time just seemed like, insanity of why would you leave this extremely lucrative, successful position to do this thing that to pretty much anyone at the time seemed like just a total lark. This thing that was just so unlikely to work. And the way that he found himself framing that decision in his own mind was what he calls a regret minimization framework, which I think is a really lovely approach to decision making, where, as you say, he projected himself forward in time and imagined himself at 80 looking back. What he realized was that he would not regret having tried, even if he failed, but he would regret not having tried. And so from that perspective, it just made the decision incredibly easy for him. And of course, we all know what happened after that.
Well, if you put aside even the current day Amazon success, I really do think this idea of the regret minimization framework, I've never thought of it that way. And it is quite beautiful, because if you're a young person or whatever age you are, to say, with the limited time that I have left, and that's always uncertain too, but to try and look ahead and say it that way, it changes the dynamics so much, because it really, if you're honest about it, it forces you out of the comfort zone to say, oh, wow, what am I afraid of, really? Because if I'm going to get to 80 and I'm going to look back, I don't want to just say I just clocked in every day for 50 years and I got a gold watch. It really is it's a great way to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's a little bit of a memento mori of sorts. It's kind of a lights a fire. But also, as you say, I think it's a really good analytical framework as well. Part of what I think is so lovely about this idea of regret minimization is that it has this formal parallel as well within the field. That there is explicitly a class of algorithms that are called regret minimization algorithms. For example, in the multi-armed bandit problem, you can formalize the notion of regret. So in this problem, you walk into this casino, there are all these different slot machines, but you don't know which ones pay out more than others until you start trying them. And so you can formalize the notion of regret as the money that you could have made if only you knew at the beginning of your time in the casino what you knew by the end. And so you can assign regret this very specific number. From there, you can ask all these sort of interesting mathematical questions. For example, how does your regret grow over time as a function of following, the best possible strategy? As it turns out, following the optimal algorithms in this problem, your regret will grow, specifically, it will grow logarithmically. The bad news is that even following the best possible strategy, you are still going to make mistakes. You're still going to continue making mistakes all the way through your life. But the frequency and the intensity of those mistakes will go down, and it will keep going down as you go through your life. And so that is something that I think is oddly consoling or very sort of heartening. Specifically, there are a set of algorithms called regret minimization algorithms that can offer this guarantee or this bound of logarithmic regret in that problem. And specifically, my favorite of these is what's called upper confidence bound. And this is another one of these things where I really feel like there's a profound life lesson in this very technical subject. So the idea of the upper confidence bound algorithm is that it says, for each of these opportunities, there is a kind of a confidence interval. There are these error bars around how good I think it could reasonably be. There's there is a middle of the bell curve where my sort of expectation lies, but there's also these tails that surround that, or these error bars that go both above and below. The upper confidence bound algorithm says just very simply, ignore your actual expectation of what's probably going to happen, ignore the worst case scenario, focus exclusively on doing the thing that has the best case scenario. And this is an algorithm that's been shown to minimize regret. And to me, that's just this very sort of human takeaway from this problem, that we can literally minimize our regrets in life by focusing on the things that have the most positive potential. To me, that's very profound.
From there, so we think about Bezos and this great framework. Now, of course, once he jumped, he then had to have his stopping point, Amazon, to some degree. Perhaps that wouldn't have worked out and he would have had to try another venture. I don't know. But it did work out. But there, on the flip side of this, there are many people that have that spirit that Jeff had. But perhaps, and I'm kind of reading from what you say here, but there's many people that they tend to over-explore. So they favor the new disproportionately over the best. You have these people that have the energy and excitement to go jump like Bezos did, but they keep jumping and they can never sit still.
Right. That there is the possibility to go too far in that direction. Yet one of the things that I think is quite interesting is having looked at the problem and looked at what characterizes the optimal strategies, the optimal algorithms in the scientific literature, there's this irresistible question, which is that what real people actually do in real life when they're confronted with these types of problems? In each chapter, we kind of delve into the psychology literature and say, what does it look like when you actually throw people into a lab setting and have them go through these sorts of tasks? Do they do what the optimal algorithm would have them do? In almost every case, the answer is no, they don't. And so there's a real opportunity there to ask, well, why is that? Is that because people are just, stupid or misinformed or kind of poorly designed by evolution for these sorts of tasks? Is it perhaps that it's the models that are wrong, that the people are in some sense doing something smarter than what the theory has gotten us to? In the case of explore-exploit problems, there is this very consistent result, which is that people tend to over-explore. They gather more information than they need to. They don't commit as much. They second-guess themselves more than they should, and that sort of thing. The famous experiment in which this comes up was one by Amos Tversky and some of his colleagues back in the either 60s or 70s. They had this setup where they had a box with two lights on it. One of the two lights would come on with varying frequency. And they said, okay, we're going to press this button that will turn one of these two lights on. We're going to do it 1,000 times. And each time you have the opportunity to either observe the light or place a bet on which light you think is going to come on. But you do not get to observe which light came on. And you do not find out until the end of the experiment whether you won or lost money on that bet. It turns out that the optimal strategy in this case is, I believe, you make 38 observations in a row, and then you blindly place a series of 962 bets on whichever light came on more at the beginning. This is not what people do at all. They are much more exploratory. They gather much more information. They will observe for a long period of time, then they will make a series of bets, then they will go back to observing, then they will make a series of more bets, then they'll go back to observing. Well, someone had a closer look at the raw data from this study and came to a realization that I think is quite significant, which is if the probabilities that these different lights were coming on was on a random walk, if it was varying over time, well, then what the human subjects were doing is in fact extremely close to the optimal solution. This is a version of the problem known as the restless bandit problem. Then you can ask the question, well, okay, why are subjects behaving as though these payoffs are volatile when we've told them ahead of time that they're fixed? I think an appropriate response to that is, Well, there's subjects in a psychology experiment, so I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to doubt the description of the scenario that the experimenters gave them, because there is a long storied history of psychology researchers lying to subjects. So I think it's probably appropriate that the subjects didn't take it on face value. But the deeper point here is that when you find yourself in one of these restless bandit problems, when the fundamental truths can change, the world itself can change, the environment that you're in can evolve, well, then you really should spend more of your time gathering information and commit for smaller stretches of time before gathering more information. And so it turns out that humans' instinct to quote unquote overexplore is in fact very well adapted for the sort of dynamic and changing world that I think better describes a lot of the scenarios that we're actually in.
We also run the risk, though. Let's say an investor, for example, wants to make an investment in Tesla. How much information do you gather and when do you stop? These become tricky questions because in many ways, I can think of many investors that would say, I want the most simplistic data, a simple price momentum, and I'll bet off the price momentum alone, versus some other investors might say, I need to have, untold amounts of fundamental information, but the untold amounts of fundamental information never end.
Yes. Right. While you are gathering all that information, you might be missing out on your best opportunity, your best window, right, to buy.
Right.
And one of the key factors in any sort of explore or exploit problem is this question of how much time you feel you have. What is the interval of time over which you are trying to optimize? By analogy, if you are living abroad, let's say for a year, the first week that you're there, even if you discover an amazing restaurant, you probably don't want to go back twice in the same week because, the second restaurant that you try in that country has a 50% chance of being better. And the third restaurant you try has a 1 in 3 chance of being better, which is pretty high. And moreover, if you do find a restaurant that's better than the best one you already know about, you have 51 weeks to enjoy it and keep going back. Conversely, if you imagine yourself in the last week of your trip, well, the odds that a restaurant that you try the odds that a new restaurant you try is better than the best ones you already know about are quite small. You're able to set a pretty high bar as a result of your experience. But furthermore, even if you did find a restaurant that was better than the ones you already know about, you've run out of time to continue to enjoy that. One of the things that you find when you look at some of the solutions to the explore-exploit trade-off is that our decision-making can and should change as a function of where we perceive ourselves to be within that interval of time. And this is, of course, something that comes up in investing context. If you have, a passive retirement account, for example, you sort of plug in your expected retirement year. A lot of these funds will typically pursue a very high risk strategy 40 years out from retirement, and then gradually, for example, move the money from stocks into bonds as you get closer to retirement. And I think the same type of dynamic exists in this question of, do I continue to gather information or do I just leverage the information that I have? It's partly a function of the amount of time over which you're going to be committed to your action. So if I'm committing a bunch of money into Tesla, to use your example, and it's going to be, locked in for, let's say, 50 years, then it probably makes sense to do a lot more of that fundamental research. But if I'm just going to be parking my money there for, a month or 6 months or something, then it's more important to just sort of try different things out and commit on the basis of what we already know.
Let me jump to another part of the book, something that I really liked, because I can keep I could stay in one chapter and just start picking your brain for the next few hours. But computers have this really great technique, this capacity to multitask, and I'm going to let you explain it. It's called threading. But we as human beings, we really don't have this ability to thread, do we? Effectively?
Yeah, I mean, not really. Just despite the fact that one of the things that really distinguishes the brain from, a computational architectural standpoint, one of the things that really distinguishes the brain is this massive parallelism. It's ironic, given that we can't really process more than one, train of thought at a time, right? Or have more than one conscious, deliberate experience at a time. We have to kind of yank our attention back and forth. And in many ways, this is, in fact, quite like what computers do. They just do it at a much faster time scale, and so they can create the illusion of doing more than one thing at the same time through this process that's called threading. And the basic idea behind threading is that you have a series of processes that are running, but the CPU can only attend to one of them at a time. It will spend a little bit of time flashing your cursor, and then yank itself to, your inbox, and spend a little bit of time, pinging to see if there's new mail in your inbox, and spend a little bit of time, buffering your audio so that your Spotify in the background keeps playing smoothly. And by hopping around from thing to thing nimbly enough and quickly enough, it can create this wonderful illusion of simultaneity. But as anyone who has used computers in the last 50 years can attest, sometimes this breaks down and we end up staring at the hourglass or the spinning beach ball of doom. And so I think it can be very instructive to understand what's actually going on under the surface in those cases, because I think there's really a connection between how a machine's time management can fall to pieces and some of the human traps that we all recognize from our own lives. The biggest pitfall for a system that's managing a multitude of threads is what's called thrashing. The basic idea behind thrashing is, as the computer is managing these different things, there's a certain amount of overhead associated with changing from one task to another. And this is known as context switching. So in a computer, that means you're repopulating your caches with different information. You are kind of bookmarking and saving your progress on the previous task so that you can come back to it later. You're finding your place in the next task and sort of queuing it up and getting started. And so there's a certain amount of fixed overhead associated with every context switch. And so if you imagine, let's just say for the sake of argument, it takes the system a tenth of a second to context switch. It's really more like a millionth of a second, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it's a tenth of a second. If you're doing 10 different things and you have a policy that you don't let something go longer than 1 second before you do at least a little bit of work on it, then the system ends up in a state where it only has a tenth of a second allocated to each task, but it requires the entirety of that tenth of a second just to page the sort of now where was I information back into its proverbial head. And so you can have a situation in which the computer is spending literally 100% of its time doing these sort of bookkeeping meta tasks. And what's really brutal about this situation is that because it is not actually advancing the state of any of its threads, it's extremely difficult to get out of because it's not doing any real work. And so it's not likely to terminate any of those processes and bring the system back to a more stable state.
Nice description of human nature, huh?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I see more of myself in that description than I'm comfortable with. I think we've all had moments where we've felt, if you've ever spent more time mentally keeping track of all of the things that you have to do than actually doing them, then you're basically in a position of thrashing, where the meta work and the bookkeeping has overwhelmed the actual work that you're doing.
Brian, let me bring up one more topic with you before I let you leave. This one really is near and dear to me. I'm so sad to see its demise, but I started as a Eudora Mail user probably in the mid 1990s. And what I loved about Eudora Mail is that, and I had to stop, I think in 2013, they stopped supporting it on the Mac. But what I loved about it is that I could sort things, right? But if I needed to search on Eudora Mail, and they've basically, all the folks in Silicon Valley have eliminated this opportunity for me. It does not exist. Eudora Mail still cannot be beat for search. If I wanted to search a decade of email and find anything from a thought to an IP address, you name it, Eudora search was just absolutely awesome. The searching versus sorting conundrum is something you cover in your work a lot. Why don't you speak to it some from your perspective, and maybe perhaps a lesson or a story that might give people a window into what you guys have discovered and put out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the canonical domains of computer science that would be familiar to any computer science student is sorting algorithms. In many ways, this is one of the canonical computer tasks. How do you sort a set of things as efficiently as possible? In the book, we get into the history of sorting algorithms and what advice they might hold for us about the best way to, organize our household items like our bookshelves and so forth. But I think that the deeper principle here is that for a computer scientist or for a computer system, there is really one and only one reason that you would sort things in the first place, which is to save yourself time searching for those things later. That, I think, is a very deep point that leads to a way of thinking about the question of sorting, which is really, should you be sorting at all? Will the act of sorting something save you more time in subsequent searches than the act of sorting it would itself take?
It's a really deep thought.
And so you end up with, in many cases, a computational argument for mess. That there are a number of things in life that, we as humans attach kind of a moral dimension to, or a guilt with something being messy. When in fact, there is this argument that can be made in a number of situations where mess is not only the easy choice, but it can also be the optimal choice. Computer science, of all things, I mean, it's ironic because we think of computers as kind of the paragons of organization. But computer science gives us the language to actually formulate the rigorous argument for mess. And that, for me, is really sort of counterintuitive and cool. It's
very cool. Really, it's there's so many kind of aha moments in this work. I really appreciate you putting it together. I do want to read one last sentence, which I think for the audience to keep you thinking as to why this is important. And this is from your work. The underlying directive of any good algorithm is to minimize the labor of thought. We all want to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the kind of unintuitive things about computer science, is that the goal of any algorithm is to minimize computing. To a computer scientist, computing in some sense is the enemy or is bad. And so I think there's something we can all sort of take heart in, that there's, in any decision-making process, there is this critical component of just knowing when to stop thinking, or knowing how hard to think about something. And computer science gives us a way of not only making the best decision when we have perfect information and all the time in the world, but it also gives us a way of thinking about how to make smart trade-offs when we don't have those luxuries. And I think that's much more often the case that we find ourselves in.
Brian, the work, Algorithms to Live By, The Computer Science of Human Decisions, with your co-author, Tom Griffiths, available everywhere. I think it's doing really well, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, we're just in our third printing now, so it's been really encouraging seeing the reception it's been getting.
You've got all Silicon Valley reading this, right?
Yeah. In fact, I just ran into a friend of mine on the subway. We were talking about the book, and the guy standing next to me, whips around and says, "Oh my God, you wrote Algorithms to Live By? I love that book." So yeah, it's really satisfying when you can feel like the work that you're doing is reaching people who are sensitive to it and who are able to take something out of it. That's really meaningful.
Beyond Amazon to buy, is there a website people should check out?
Algorithmstoliveby.com.
Brian, I thank you for taking the time. Hopefully I can have you on again when the next work comes, because I know a next work will come.
Absolutely. It's been a total pleasure. So I would love that. Thank you very much for having me.
Now for my second guest on this mega episode, Bill Bonner. Before I introduce my guest today, I want to read 4 passages from his newest work. First, the idea that government's mission is to make things better is false. Government is best understood as a naturally occurring struggle between the outsiders and the insiders. By definition, insiders always control the government and use it to maintain existing power, status, and wealth relationships and exploit the outsiders. Everybody or everyone who isn't either feeble-minded or a saint wants wealth, power, and status. And the easiest, fastest way to get it usually is to take it away from someone else. Taking wealth away from someone else gives you a clear advantage. He has less, you have more. If you make these transfers law, your opponent is at an even more of a disadvantage. Thus, the popularity of government. This second passage is missing the first sentence, but I think you'll get the point. This corrective mechanism does not operate so well in a government program. Failure is often not noticed, and if it is noticed, there may be little incentive to fix it. In fact, the incentives could face the opposite direction. A failure may bring more or continued financing, whereas a success may make the project self-extinguishing. Most often, however, the government employees need not worry. Programs are rife with vague and immeasurable goals. Many are constructed in such a way that they can never actually succeed. And most are purely BS anyway. This third passage I really love. The pretension of the central planner, government, is that he knows a better future, one that he can design and bring about. The godlike vanity of this assertion is staggering. No one really knows what future is best for humankind. People only know what they want. But one more great passage, and this goes right to the rigging, the absolute rigging of interest rates over the decades. But the feds try to stretch the addiction out as long as possible. Why? Because running a rehab clinic can be a good business, especially if the patients never recover. Patients are never allowed to hit bottom. They never get better. And the quacks keep transferring more and more wealth and power to themselves and their friends. Now, I really don't care about your partisan desire, your partisan interest. If you've got a modicum of intelligence, if you know just a little bit, you know those 4 passages I just read are spot on, 100% truth. And those passages are from a book, Hormageddon, How Too Much of a Good Thing Leads to Disaster. My guest today is Bill Bonner, author, publisher. I hope you enjoy this conversation. As I go through your work, one of the first questions I start to have about you is not your current work. We're going to get to that in detail. But I want to know the start. I want to know the young man, Bill Bonner, and where this skepticism came from to then start to understand how the pieces fit together. Because there had to have been revelations. There had to have been early experiences that triggered you.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think like everybody else, but probably like everybody else, I just kind of went on my way for a long time and didn't probably think much differently from anybody else about anything. But I then, when I got out of college, I had a job in Washington. A friend of mine had started this thing he called the National Taxpayers Union. And it was a grassroots organization supported by members who sent in like $15. It was really very small. And very small potatoes. He had maybe a couple thousand members at that time. But he asked me to help him, and I wasn't doing anything, so I said, okay, I'll help you. And that's where I guess my brain started to work, because I saw how Washington worked, how it really wasn't at all what we were taught in school. It doesn't work that way. It's an entirely different thing. And Washington is, now we're seeing it more clearly. And this is, now we're 40 years later, and 40 years later, it's coming into focus much more clearly. But back then, it was a total revelation to me. And by the way, this was the same time. This was like 1970s, and then I left in about 1983. A whole thing was going on there, which I talk about now. And now I see that era as sort of the pivotal era. But anyway, the question is, well, what made me think the way I think? And I think that experience was probably the turning point, where I was in Washington watching people do things. And I remember my first kind of revelation when, we were lobbying politicians, and there was a senator, and I don't even remember his name, but there's a senator from California, and we were talking to him about some issue. We, arguing the taxpayer's point of view, were saying, it really doesn't make sense to spend this money. And after a while, I realized that the person I was talking to was not there. He was a hollow man. He was somebody who looked good, and when he talked, you thought, well, this guy, he's got an education, he sounds pretty reasonable. But after a while, I realized that he was not there. He was not interested. He had no interest at all in it, and no information, no curiosity. He was there to play a role. And it's probably a role he played all his life. I realized that there's a whole other world there going on in Washington, and people had come there not to do something, but to be something. They came because they wanted to be in the power game. They wanted to make a lot of money. They wanted to feel important. They wanted to impress their friends back home. It was all kind of a theatrical exercise. Well, not at all what I had been taught in school. So that opened my eyes, and I guess one thing led to another. So, well, wow, if that's the way this works, probably the rest of the world works the same way, which is to say, not the way you think it ought to work, or not the way you thought it worked. At that time, I guess I did become rather cynical, skeptical, and always wondering, well, how does this really work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I still own property in Fairfax County, Virginia. In fact, I ran for political office when I was 21 in Fairfax County, Virginia. And I still remember meeting one of the most famous politicians in Fairfax County at the time. And I remember shaking his hand, and it was a very similar experience to what you described. It was like shaking the hand of a dead fish. I mean, he wasn't there. He was, I was a young guy. I remember he shook my hand. He was looking at his shoes. It was an empty vessel. But, it's difficult to describe what you're talking about, because, every year they come out with the top 10 wealthiest counties in America, and usually 5 to 6 of them surround D.C. But I don't think that resonates. Well, maybe it's starting to resonate, but I don't know if it still resonates as well with people.
It's beginning. I'd say it's beginning. And I think it begun with the concern that people have that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and then they will look at see who the rich are and say, oh, it's not what I thought at all. It's the people around Washington. Well, how are they getting rich? And then you start to think about the whole thing. But you have a long way to go from the 1970s to a young man in the 1970s kind of opening his eyes to the fact that it doesn't work the way you think it works, to today when it doesn't work even close to the way you thought it should work. It's an entirely different thing. And what has happened during that period, of course, is the government has grown. I say government. If you look at the percentage of the GDP taken by government, it has not grown. And so when I say government has grown, people say, no, that's not true. It's not grown. But what's really happened is that the government is much, much bigger than ever, even though it's not called government, because now you have all those people around Washington some of them used to work in the private sector, and many of them still work in the private sector, but it's the private sector that's been taken over by this thing which people are calling now the deep state. The deep state is much bigger, much deeper, much more profound and far-reaching, because the deep state is into everything. And no matter what you do, now you work part of your time for the government, and not just to pay taxes, but just to conform to the government regulations. And that is so extensive, so pervasive, that you see the government's hand in almost everything. The government is much, much bigger, and not just the government that we elect, not the government that we pay for directly, but the government we pay for indirectly includes almost all of Wall Street, which works as a financier for the government and for the people who maintain the government. It's much different. And so when you go from 1970s to trying to understand to today to still trying to understand, but you see there's a whole world evolved in the meantime. Of course, that's the subject of most of my writing, is that the evolution of the monetary system, the financial system, the economy itself. But all that happened together. And it all happened together for a lot of reasons, and you can't put your finger on one reason or one person and say, there's the guy pointing. But it's all part of a big transition that's taken place, and which always takes place. If you look back through history, you find every government, if it can, becomes kind of an empire, and every empire follows more or less the same path, where people glom onto it, and special interests take advantage of it, and the military takes control of it, and then it's bigger and bigger and more encumbered with more debt, and more hangers-on, and more zombies. I call them zombies and cronies. People who taking a little privilege that they can get from this big, huge monster of a government, and then eventually it collapses because it can't go on. It gets too expensive, too weighty, too anchored in the past.
You know, Bill, what's really interesting about your work, too, considering I've just watched basically a day of this Super Tuesday cycle nonsense, you're not a guy, though, in your work. You're taking this to another level. You're not a guy that's spending his time in cantankerous partisan debates. That's not the point. And I would love for you to expand upon the title of your most recent work. And I think specifically the phrase hormesis. I think it'd be really great to start to break that apart, because there's a real learning lesson that once you put the politics aside, all of these politicians are trying to get their power levers, their control of the state.
The hormesis is this process where they've noticed, I think about a century ago, that you can give to an organism, you give a little teeny bit of poison. I don't know what kind of poison. You give a little teeny bit of something that is poison. It will actually stimulate the organism. The organism will do better. But you give a little bit more and it dies. And that got me to thinking about this whole phenomenon, which, Mae West described it as, too much of a good thing is great. Too much of a good thing is wonderful. Well, the thing that she had in mind probably, might be wonderful, but most things, almost everything else in the world, you give too much of, and it's bad. And the economists have known this for a long time, that there's this phenomenon of declining marginal utility, where, you get the first dollar you get, you say, wow, that's great. Second dollar, that's pretty good. And then you go on and on, you get $1 billion, and then somebody gives you another dollar, and you don't care. In fact, at some point, it becomes a burden. It really does become a burden. This expression, wealth is a burden. Well, you get enough wealth, it's such a burden that you have to give it away. You have to find something to do with it, because it doesn't, after you have the car that you want, the house that you want, the life that you want, the vacations, the meals, what do you do with money? You don't. You can't. It doesn't change your life one bit. If you're a billionaire, and that's, of course, why Facebook, Zuckerberg gave away so much money. And people were amazed that he gave away his fortune. But that fortune was worthless to him. It was worthless. He could not change his life one bit using that money. It had to pass the point of marginal decline. And when things happen like that, and I use an example which I think is in an entirely different area in the book. First I call the book Hormageddon. It's a combination of this phenomenon of hormesis with Armageddon. It's the disaster that you get when you keep giving more and more of this poison to people. Well, if you ask anybody in America, especially America today, and you say, it's security, we need more security. And then you go through an airport security line, they're patting down a grandmother who just got out of a wheelchair. I've seen this many times. Patting down, and they, sometimes I will say, snidely, sarcastic, they say, I guess you can't be too secure, or I guess you can't take any chances. It's idiotic because everybody knows, everybody in the whole line, 100 people waiting in line, they all know that it's a waste of time, but they all go through it. But that expression, you just can't be too careful. It's wrong. You can be too careful. You can be much too careful. And I use this example of Germany because after World War I, Germany had been badly defeated, and then badly treated by the Allies afterwards because the Germans had thought they signed an armistice, which is not a surrender. It's just a stop. It got turned into something else, and eventually they were totally at the mercy of the France and England and America. The Germans, they had to give up part of their country. They had to agree to pay these reparations, which were so much that they could never possibly pay them. So they were really, really in bad shape, and they had seen what it's like when you don't have any defenses, because they were defenseless at that point. They had no fuel, no ammunition. They couldn't do anything. Along came this guy whom we all know and everybody refers to, Adolf Hitler. And he says, we need more security in this country. That was effectively was his message. We need to make Germany great again. And he went about in the way you would expect, rebuilding the defenses of Germany. And everybody at the time, including Americans and including English people who went to Germany in the 30s, said, well, this guy's doing a great job. He is helping to renew the country. The factories are working again. People have jobs again. The economy is humming again. And it all looked great. And so you'd say, well, boy, that sure worked well. But he didn't stop. If a little bit of security was a good thing, a lot of security would be a lot better. So he kept going and going and going. Towards the end of it, and the end of it, of course, was a disaster. But at the end of it, half of the entire output of Germany was directed to the military. And that was a disaster. I mean, things go very, very bad when you overdo it. And that was just one example that I used, but it's true in everything. And now we are in an economy which has too much debt. And I keep saying it's too much debt, and people say, well, how do you know it's too much debt? Well, it's too much debt when it starts falling apart, when people can't pay their debts. And if you price the debt properly, at a reasonable interest rate, 3% or something, there'd be no way to pay it. And we know these governments like Japan can never pay its debt. It's a declining population, and the debts are way beyond anything that could ever be managed. And what do? They go further into debt. So that's got to be a bad idea. But this whole Armageddon idea is just an observation, and it's practically irrefutable that when you get too much of something, by definition, it's too much. And when you get too much, you don't get, getting more doesn't help you. What you want is less.
I was thinking of a great contemporary example that everyone's facing right now. I still recall my CPA telling me in 1998 when my business was starting out, he said, Mike, just get a couple million in the bank free and clear, 6% a year interest, you'll be fine. And so now we have an entire generation that saved money. And here's where it gets really insidious. Of course, we've seen zero interest rate policy. But I would love for you to comment on where we're going now, because it seems like really brave new territory. This is well beyond too much of a good thing, but we're now into the land of negative interest rates. And to me, I maybe people think I'm overreacting, but a negative interest rate seems sadistic. It's for savers that have not understood what's been going on, the central planning activity for all these decades. To now throw upon people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even over 100 years of age, to throw upon them the idea that interest is gone and now we're going to take some from you every month. It's criminal. It's terrible.
The whole thing is so absurd. When you start to think about it, first your mouth drops open, and then your brain starts to hurt, because it's very, very hard to understand. I mean, it's just in a purely theoretical or metaphysical way, you can't figure out what is a negative interest rate. What is it theoretically? I know what a positive interest rate is, where somebody gives you something and in return you give them you pay them for lending you something. If they lend you a car, you expect to pay for the car. If they lend you money, you expect to pay for the money. But now we have something negative interest rates. You lend somebody money, and you pay them to take it. And it's so absurd on its face that, I'm just stunned sometimes. It turns on its head the whole way in which the world actually works. And the way the world works was described in the book of Genesis. I'd like to refer to this because it takes it back right to the very beginning, to the original sin in the Garden of Eden. And Adam and Eve were expelled, and the Lord said, from the sweat of your brow shall you earn your bread. He was saying, in effect, the way it actually works. You've got to work in order to earn something. Money is what you earn. Money is a substitute. It represents wealth. You go out, you prune the vineyard, you take care of the grapes, you harvest the grapes, you put them into wine. The wine that you drink in the wintertime is the fruit, it's the result, it's the output of the work that you did in the summer. That's the way the world really works. And money is simply a representation of this real wealth. If you take it, you now turn it around and you say, no, I'm going to give you money before you go out in the vineyard. It's something entirely different. It's anti-money. It's negative money. It's something that's not worth anything. It only will be worth something if you go out in the vineyard and eventually you make some wine, and eventually we can drink the wine. And it turns the whole thing on its head. Now, I'm just talking about the theoretical issue, that it can't exist. It's in the, it's one of those oxymorons, like an honest politician. It just doesn't exist that way. And when you start talking about it, you start thinking about it, you realize that it's an impossibility. There's no way. Because let's say, if it were true that money, you can give somebody money and then you're happy if they give you back some less money later on, it means that your money really had no value. It means that the money was an encumbrance, so that you had to pay somebody to stock it for you, to hold it for you, to use your money. It'd be like if you had a piece of cherry pie and you didn't want to eat it because you knew it was awful. You have to pay somebody else to eat it because you didn't want to leave it sitting around. I mean, it's all absolutely absurd. Now, if it were true, let's say we've gone through some time warp, through some black holes in space and time, and suddenly money is not worth anything, or it's worth less than nothing, according to the negative interest rate idea. So now, what does that mean? I worked all my life to accumulate some money. So I saved up $200,000. And now I discover, as you're talking about the saver, I discover that $200,000 is worth less than zero. I mean, I've got to pay somebody to stock this stuff, or pay somebody to take it off my hands. That means that all that work that I did, all that time that I spent in the vineyard, what was that worth? How about all those bottles of wine that I made during all my career? Are they worth nothing too? I mean, the whole thing is just so absurd.
The social contract is broken. I mean, it's
yeah, the whole thing. Yeah, exactly. The social contract is broken. The whole idea of an economy of work leading to output, leading to money, leading to investment, leading to further output, and so on. The whole thing falls apart, which, of course, it does fall apart. That's just the theoretical thing. So people say, well, forget the theory. What we're trying to do is drive up demand in these economists. Well, there's some, I'm just reading a quote from George Well. There are some ideas so stupid that only an intellectual could believe them. That's true of NERP. You have to be a PhD economist to believe that you can actually stimulate an economy by imposing negative interest rates. In fact, the way it really works is it's a tax. If you have money, you put it in the bank, and then the bank charges you. It's just a tax on your money. So you think, well, how does taxing people's money actually make people better off? Well, of course it doesn't. You take away people's money, they have less money. And then, so how does taxing people's money increase consumer demand, or increase investment demand, or cause people to get those animal spirits that you need to lift up an economy? Well, of course it doesn't. It does just the opposite. And in fact, although NERP is an entirely new thing, the world has never gone through a sustained period of NERP, but Europe has been in a kind of NERP for a while, and now we're seeing just what we'd expect to see. Savings rates are not going down, they're going up. meaning just what you'd expect. People having some money taken from them now are reacting by saving more money because at the end of the day, they're saving for retirement. They're saving for their daughter's weddings. They're savings for all kinds of things. They need the money. And taking the money from them through this policy of NERP is absolutely idiotic. It doesn't cause them to go out and spend. Just the opposite. It causes them to close up their wallets, save more money, bunker down, stop spending, all the things that they didn't want them to do. The whole thing is absolutely absurd.
One of the reasons this can even exist is the false notion that people think that government is there to help. It's there to provide some type of nice service for them. And you point out in your work that it's not about government helping or doing something nice for you. This is all about a struggle between the outsiders and the insiders. Why don't you speak to that?
There's a very good book out by a guy named Harari called something like The History of Humankind. And what he points out, which I hadn't fully realized before, was that myths are very important in the human society. And myths are, he believes, the one thing that separates, I think, capacity for myth, is the one thing that separates the animal kingdom from human kingdom. Because people, with their brains, are able to develop a whole mythology that holds them together. Without this mythology, and it's called, he uses the word mythology because it's something you can't prove. It's something outside of physical reality. And you have to start with recognizing that there are different kinds of reality. There's one kind of reality. If you go out in the sun on a bright day and, you're like me, you've got Irish skin, you're going to get burned. That's a reality. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter, what the Republican platform is. It doesn't matter what the terrorists in Syria are doing or anything. That's a reality. And then there's another kind of reality where I'm walking down the street and some terrorist comes and shoots me dead. Terrorist comes and shoots me dead. Now, that's reality. I have been shot dead. I am, in fact, dead. But that reality is composed of other kinds of mythology. The myth is that there's some sort of war between, radical Muslims and Christians or something or other. I mean, there's a whole mythology. There's no reason for that person to do that except that it's based on some kind of myth. And all wars are based on some kind of myth that somebody thinks that this should be that way or that should be this way or we should own that land or, you should free the slaves or we want an independent country. Those are myths in that they're composed reality. They create reality because they kill you, but they're not reality separated from our beliefs. They're a part of our beliefs. What happens over time is that you get a buildup of a structure that makes possible civilized life. And say in the time of Hammurabi, the Hammurabi Code said very clearly, it said that there were differences between people. There are people who are slaves, and there are inferior people, and then there are superior people, something like that. And there are women and men. And it said that if you kill a slave, you have to pay 200 shekels or something. If you kill a free man, you have to pay 500 shekels. And if you kill a superior man, then you have to pay 1,000 shekels. Well, that was the mythology that held together the society. Everybody, I presume, more or less, everybody kind of went along with that. That's the way it was. And then now we don't believe that. We have a new mythology, which is all men are created equal. So if you kill somebody, you have to pay the same amount. Doesn't matter. And both of those things are myths. They create a world. They create a world because we share a myth. Neither one can be proven that men are the same or not the same or anything. Those are just totally myths. But because of those beliefs, we're able to hold together a society.
The nature of Hormageddon, though, is this is about bubble creation. This is the insiders with power. And this goes to only one end. It has a logical conclusion every time. There's a pattern across all different types of domains, and there's an ending that's very bitter, and it only comes one way.
our conception of government, as you can see, between Hammurabi and today is very different. But it's all based on a myth, in both cases. And our myth today was a myth that evolved over the last couple hundred years. It didn't come from nowhere. It evolved. And why did it evolve that way? Well, you can have a long discussion about why people believe, what they believe, when they believe. But they seem to come to believe what they need to believe when they need to believe it, which is to say they need to fit in, they need to operate, they need to get along with the rest of the world. Well, government is fundamentally an instrument of what I call pre-civilization. In the long sweep of history, man's survival was based on violence. Tribes survived by killing things, really. I mean, they had gatherers, certainly, and typically, anthropologists have studied this at great length as best they can because nobody was around 50,000 years ago, based upon the tribes that they find still living in a kind of a Neolithic way. They figure that back in the old days, they had people they gathered, but in order to survive, especially in north of the tropics, you needed enough calories, and you could only really get enough calories from animals. So the people survived by killing things. They killed animals, but they also killed each other. And it's amazing how much research, how much has been discovered over the last 10, 20 years, where they find these bones from 10, 20,000 years ago, and they are bones of humans that have been killed by other humans because they have arrowheads stuck in the bones, or they have the heads cut off or something or other. These anthropologists were puzzled about it, but they more and more speculate and more understand, I think, that life in the primitive world was very violent, and you had to have a strong leader, you had to have an army, you had to be ready to leap into action to defend your tribe, to defend your territory, defend your women, and that we are hardwired for that kind of thing. And so that's the way it happened. If you wanted any kind of wealth, by the way to get it was to take it from somebody else, and that's still in primitive tribes. That's what happens, and
that kind of works today too, huh?
Well, it does work today. I'm getting to that. But so this is what we are wired for. There was a big change about 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, and still going on. It's not from one day to the next, but it's gradual. It's a lot of backsliding and so on. Civilization arose. And civilization required a different way of looking at things. It required myths. It required myths about how you get along with other people because you had to live with other people. It's one thing before civilization, trading was very, very limited. We think that people went trading all over, but there was really very limited trade, and there was a lot of. And you met somebody, Margaret Mead, who was the famous anthropologist, that said that in primitive societies, if you were walking through the savannah or the jungle and you met somebody from your own tribe, you would sit down and you would chew the fat or whatever you would do. If you met somebody from another tribe, you would immediately try to kill him because that's the way it works. And you see that even in chimpanzees. They've now realized that chimpanzees conduct wars, that they have strategies, they conduct wars, and they intentionally try to exterminate other groups of chimpanzees. So anyway, that was all the prehistory, but civilization required different rules. And it required that when you met somebody, you couldn't try to kill them because you had to get along with them and because you had to live in a big city with lots of people you never met. So it was with the rise of civilization that we also find the rise of religions. And the Old Testament speaks to that period, that change in the Old Testament between the chosen people always at war, always killing one another, and God told them to kill everybody. And then the New Testament, the evolving religion round about a few thousand years ago, where all of a sudden Jesus comes along and says, thou shalt not kill. Or the Bible says that, God says thou shalt not kill. And Jesus said, treat everybody as you would want to be treated yourself, which is totally revolutionary. Totally revolutionary. Treating everybody as you would want to be treated is the rule for civilized capitalism. In order to conduct business, in order to get along in a city, in order to live with other people and do deals, you have to have a certain level of trust that people will do to you more or less what you would do to them. So you go into a bakery, you buy a loaf of bread. You don't know the baker. You don't know what he put in the bread. You don't know where it came from. You don't know who grew it. You don't know how it was processed. You don't know what kind of things might have happened to it. But you trust, because you have this built up mythology, more than a mythology. It's a method of operating or so, in which you're pretty sure that it'll be all right. That he, in order to get along with you, is not going to sell you bread that will make you sick. All of modern commerce works, all of civilization works that way, with a lot of backsliding, because there is still government. And government is an instrument of pre-civilization. It's an instrument of brute force, where instead of making a deal with somebody, all of modern civilized commerce is based on win-win. I'll give you something, you give me something. It's got to be win-win or nobody would do the deal. That's the way it is. And Donald Trump says, no, I don't want win-win. I want to win-lose. I want to win. But the other guy has to think he wins too. I mean, everybody, in order to do the deal, everybody's got to think he wins. But in government, in pre-civilized order, it works entirely differently. There is no win-win. It is always win-lose. The government takes, the government conquers. Throughout history, that's the way it always has been. And when you go back to Europe, in the 18th century, they had these people called rentiers. And the rentier was somebody who lived off of land rents, typically land rents. But there were a lot of other forms. You could have had a toll booth, or a monopoly on salt, or a monopoly on tobacco, or something or other. But the rentier was an expression of the old pre-civilized way of doing business, where his ancestor, probably, in some long-forgotten crime, they had conquered Europe. Europe was conquered by tribes, and the strong man of the tribe set himself up in a castle, and around him all the peasants worked away, and they paid him rent, and then he paid rent to his superior, and then he paid rent to his superior, a system of feudalism or vassalage. But that system is based on this very ancient way of doing things, this pre-civilized way. But that pre-civilized way is government in action. Government is fundamentally an instrument of pre-civilized life, where it's win-lose, where you win by brute force, you conquer, you insist. As Mao says, the government comes out of the barrel of a gun, and that is still true today. But what happened after, in the 18th and 19th century, there was the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and all of a sudden it looked like government could be changed. It looked like government could be of, by, and for the people, not by the conquering classes, not by the hereditary rich, the elite, and so on. It looked like government could be something that could arise naturally from the people themselves, and they could decide amongst themselves with free elections how things should work. And that idea, that myth, stuck. That myth is why everybody yesterday was lined up at polling stations, and they were there before dawn. They're standing in line before dawn to cast a ballot in an election, because they believe the myth. They believe that their vote really does count, that they really do control the government, that they can make a better world by helping to tell the government what it should do. All that is becoming clearer and clearer is a total myth. The chances of them affecting at all the outcome of the political race is about zero. And then the chance, even if their man wins, the chance of him doing what they want him to do is about zero. And then even if he does what they want him to do, the chances of that actually improving the world are less than zero, because it doesn't work that way. The whole thing is a compound myth. But our idea, we wouldn't be having this conversation if our idea had not evolved, our mythology had not evolved, so that we believe, that we collectively, we believe in democracy. We believe that we really do control government. We believe that government is not about brute force. Of course, that's not true. That's what government is. It is about brute force. Finally, at the end of the day, that's what it is, and that's all it is. Because if it were something else, it would be like the Rotarians, or like the church, or like a business, or like every other institution in our lives. We have institutions all over the place, credit card companies, newspaper publishers, bakers, shoemakers. None of them rely on force.
One of the things that's really interesting in listening to you right now is in my own mind, I'm thinking there's information, there's wisdom. And so many people, especially with communication advances like the internet in the last 15, 20 years, we're inundated with information. It's information overload. I don't know that, you've got a great analogy in Hormageddon about driving your truck across the country, and, the real differences in the last 30 years, and they're not that great. And I'm thinking to myself, the internet's cool. I mean, it's connected us all, but most people don't use it like a vast research library. They use it for just silly information. And as I listen to you, what you're really passing along is wisdom. And I think it's harder and harder for the average person to find the difference, or to even understand, to get past just information and to actually get to wisdom, because these stories that have been presented by the central planners, they're very difficult for the average person to get around and actually understand that they are just made up stories.
No, you're absolutely right about that. And I was looking at something today, because if you want to try to figure things out, things are complicated. Life is complicated. The world is complicated. You've got to spend time thinking about it. And now I turn on my computer in the morning, and immediately my thought process ends, because there's all these things I've got to read. I've got to read what happened in the primary, who says what about whatever, and it's very, very hard to keep up with all that stuff. And, they make a distinction between the urgent and the important. And now we are all assaulted by the urgent, and nobody's got time to sit around and think about anything that's important, because we race, we get like 10,000 messages a day that we got to deal with. I feel like I get about 10,000 emails a day that I've got to deal with. And there's no time to stop and think. I'm lucky, very lucky, in that I have a career, a job where I'm support myself by thinking about these things and writing about these things. But how many people can do that? Almost nobody. And I guess that makes me feel very special. But in fact, I don't really know that I'm right either. I'm just thinking about it and reading and trying to put the pieces together. But I certainly could be wrong. But anyway, I saw a figure today when I was just looking it up here, actually on my little cell phone while we were talking, because it shows how idiotic the whole system is. They did a poll of Americans about how the government works. They don't know how the government works. They don't even know how it's supposed to work. They can't have that revelation in that moment when they say, wait a minute, this doesn't work like I thought it works, because they never even thought about how it worked. Here it is right here. The National Constitution Center did a poll. They found that 41% of Americans are not aware that there are three branches of government. 62% of them can't name them, and 33% can't name a single one of them. You can't be shocked that the government doesn't work the way you thought it did when you had no idea how it should.
One of the things that I think is really fascinating about this notion of information and wisdom is economists, specifically a lot of the data that comes from economists, their stats, et cetera. And you've got a great line in your work. You talk about, in the hands of the economist, the more precise the number, the bigger the lie. Now, for me, for just an average guy, I would have thought that more people would have realized that when Bernanke was out in 2005 and 2006 saying there was no real estate bubble, no possibility of that. But then the same guy was the savior in 2008 and 2009 and on the magazine, on the cover of Time magazine. You would think that more people would have said, something seems a little funny here. But it just doesn't happen when it comes to economists. And they've got such a special stranglehold in this central planning utility. Why don't you talk about the more precise the number, the bigger the lie?
Well, economics is not what you think it is. And in fact, it's not what economists think it is, because the economics profession changed remarkably over the last, say, 50 years. And before, the profession was created by people like Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson. And these people were not at all the people like today's economists. They thought of themselves as moral philosophers. In fact, they called themselves moral philosophers because they were just trying to figure out how it works. They were observing. And they were observing it, and Adam Ferguson said this very clearly, they were observing it as though it were a hive of bees. They weren't trying to tell the bees what to do. They were just trying to figure out how the thing worked. And then in the last century, in the 20th century, the economists really got too big for their britches, and they started seeing that they could play a bigger role in things. They could start telling people not only how the economy did work, which they didn't know, but also how it should work and how they could make it better. But guess what? How many of the last, back since 1970, there have been 7 recessions. How many of those do you think economists predicted? Well, 0.
Yeah,
not a single one. Not a single one. And meanwhile, did economists, and that of course includes the recession that happened after the crash in 2008, even in early 2008, the markets were crashing, everything was going to hell in a handcart, and they did a poll of economists by the Federal Reserve did a poll, and they found that not a single one, thought that we were entering a recession. Now, these people just don't know anything. But they pretend to know everything, and that's why, and what happened back in the 20th century was they started using numbers. Adam Smith didn't use numbers except in the most basic way to say, well, we have so-and-so many tons of iron ore output coming out of Aberdeen or something like that. But now they have these compound fictions that they use to describe and control and manipulate the economy. And one of those, of course, is the unemployment rate that we hear about all the time. And they say, well, unemployment is 5.7%. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean it's really 5.7%? Well, no, it means something, but it doesn't mean anything that's worth anything because the whole idea of it is not subject to math. They act as if it's a precise number, 5.7%, but in fact, you're walking down the street. A guy comes up to you, a bum, and the bum says, can you give me $1? And you say, no, but I got a little work to do behind the house. And he says, well, what kind of work? You have a discussion with him. Now, the first thing is that person unemployed? Well, if you can't answer that question, you certainly can't come up with a precise number for unemployed people because he is somewhere in there, or should be somewhere in there. But no, he's probably not in there anyway because they only include people who are unemployed fairly recently. And this guy's probably been unemployed forever. But anyway, so you say to the guy, okay, I just want you to move some boxes. And then he says, oh, well, how much will you pay me for moving the boxes? And I say, I'll pay you $10. And he says, no, I'll do it for 15. And you say, no, that's too much money. And he says, okay, that's it. Never mind. All right, now, what about this guy? Is he unemployed or employed? Well, he's unemployed, but he could be employed. It's just not it's not subject to the kind of scientific analysis. It's subject to a human analysis. Look, every decision about being employed or not employed is subject to a whole range of questions. And a person doesn't want to cross the street, doesn't want to cross town, doesn't want to go to the next city to get a job. Is that person unemployed? Is that person unemployable? Or where does that person fit in? I mean, a person himself doesn't know whether he can get a job or not because it all depends on the circumstances. Anyway, the only point I'm making is that these numbers that they use are all fictions, and they're all compound fictions. And the GDP growth rate, for example, that we rely on to say whether the economy is expanding, it's absolute fiction. I mean, it's just made up, a number made up of a lot of things with a lot of economists working on it, but it doesn't tell you whether anybody's getting better off or worse off. Not at all. That would depend on, that's a value judgment about whether things are getting better or not. And economists realized long ago that they can only add and subtract quantity. They can't have anything to do with quality. And quality is the way we measure our lives. Quality is what really counts. I used an example in that book, by the way, which I thought was pretty funny, because the New York Times had an article about a guy. He was an immigrant to America, lived in Chicago, drove a taxi cab. At the age of 55, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So, oh, well, I'm going to go back to Greece. He was from Greece. I'm going back to my Greek island home, and I'm going to die there. All right, so he goes to Greece, and he gets to his Greek island home, and there, he doesn't die. He starts a garden. He starts raising his vegetables, and then he's out in the sun all day. I don't know why he didn't, but he started living a very healthy way, I guess, and he didn't die. He lived for another almost 50 years, because about 40 years, because he died just a couple of years ago in his 90s. You think about that as a GDP thing. That island, he was from Ikaria in Greece, that island had no employment. He, going there, raising his garden, he moved into his parents' home, he did nothing. Zero for GDP, because he didn't get a job. He didn't die. If he died, they would have called the mortician. The mortician would have made some money. Would have called the coffin maker. The coffin maker would have made some money. Would have called the grave digger. The grave digger would have made some money. It would have been a boost for the whole economy. But he didn't die, and he didn't go to the doctor. He didn't even pay the doctor. He didn't pay the hospital. He didn't pay the insurance. He didn't do any of that stuff. He went to his parents' home, didn't build a house, didn't renovate a house, no GDP increase at all, raised his own vegetables, and lived for 40 years. And the New York Times article said, until he was in his 90s, he would go out at night and they go dancing at a local pub. But here's the point. GDP did not go up. It went down because of this guy. If he died in America, he would have bought a casket, but he didn't die. He lived. This guy is not worse off. He's better off. The GDP did not measure anything worth measuring. And if you look at it in a broad sense, that's true everywhere. It measures how fast people go into debt, but it doesn't measure whether people are really getting any better off.
The book is a great read. We're just skimming the surface. You do a very deep dive. It's Hormageddon, How Too Much of a Good Thing Leads to Disaster. And I think one thing the audience should keep in mind with this conversation is that in modern society, right now times, when you have the NERP, as we talked about earlier, we have the ever-increasing debt, we have the ever-increasing power of the central planners, the growth of government, there is ultimately an endpoint. And nobody can really predict when or how it will all unfold. But when you piece these things together, as you've done so eloquently in your work, we know it will happen. We just don't know exactly when. But, any thinking person that goes through Hormageddon knows that this is all true. You just can't time it exactly, can you?
No, and that's the thing. Is the longer it takes to arrive, the more people think it never will. And then when it does, the more people are shocked, puzzled, and deeply devastated.
The book is Hormageddon, How Too Much of a Good Thing Leads to Disaster. Bill, is there a best website we can send people to?
BonnerandPartners.com.
Okay, great. Bill, I appreciate you talking today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up as number 3 on this mega episode, Kathleen Eisenhart. I know you want it complex. Everything is complex. Your solution must be complex. The world is complex. That's the bill of goods that you've been sold. Here's the dirty little secret. The best and the brightest, the most successful, have developed fantastically simple rules for our ever more complex and chaotic life. Simple works best. You can see this in all walks of life. Of course, in my world, in the trading world, absolutely 100% simple. Now, the philosophy, the psychology, the system itself, there might be quite a bit of depth, but the execution in any endeavor, any discipline today, you're going to find your great success with simple rules. My guest today is Kathleen Eisenhart from Stanford. She is the co-director of the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. Her latest book, Simple Rules, How to Survive in a Complex World. It's funny because right when I announced that I'm going to have Kathleen on my program, it's amazing how many people have reached out to me and said, "Oh, I'm reading that book right now. That's a great book. I love that book." Today, Kathleen breaks apart some of the key issues, the core concepts in her study of simple rules. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kathleen Eisenhart. We're going to dig into the content of simple rules, but I know you've been at this subject for a long time in papers before your book. Give me a starting point, a genesis, the beginning, how this started to happen with you and your co-author. How did it all start?
This actually started, I was working with one of my former doctoral students, Shona Brown. We were looking at computer companies in the late 90s or so, and we were trying to figure out why some had could do product after product after product really successfully, and others couldn't. It was a global study, and we saw that the companies that had way too much structure, too many rules, could really efficiently get out the wrong product. On the other hand, we also saw that the companies that had no rules at all were having a great time, but they couldn't get any products out either. We started to realize there was this middle of a small amount of structure, semi-structure, simple rules was really kind of a differentiator. And so that was the original set of ideas that Shona and I came up with. Shona was then a McKinsey consultant and then went on to be senior VP of operations at Google before their IPO and then after their IPO. So she started using some of the ideas at Google. I was still in academics, and then Don Sull and I hooked up, and we said, we're seeing this not just in computer companies. We're seeing this phenomenon in top executives, in top firms, and in successful people in regular life. That they're able to distill what they're doing into a small number of rules, and then to be very focused on the one hand on those rules, but also very flexible because the rules weren't very many. So that's the genesis, if you will.
I started to notice going through your work. I immediately thought to myself, okay, I know you have reached out to or looked at other works of other people in academia. For example, I immediately thought of Spiros Malkadakis. I immediately thought of Gerd Gigerenzer, and boom, I saw them both in your index. I realized that there's this many people touching on this subject area, but kind of going in their own different directions. But you brought this more into the world of business. But even though it's more than just business, it could be investing, entertainment, all different types of fields where simple rules beat the complexity.
Right. And that was what we started. Don Sull, my co-authors at MIT, he and I started to realize it wasn't just business. It was lots of places, and also I think we both didn't really want to write a business book. I'm in academics. I've written lots of academic papers, done some book things, and none of my friends care what I do. And so I got to thinking, I want to write a book that my book group will read, and a book that's a broader book. And so that's really why we went to a book that has sports and entertainment and investing, and when we give talks, talk about raising our kids, going on diet. We're trying to pull together some ideas, but also talk to that broader audience.
Why don't you just define simple rules? We've talked about it generally already, but why don't you define simple rules from your perspective, something simple that people can immediately wrap their arms around?
Okay, simple rules are rules of thumb. It's probably the easiest thing to think about them. But simple rules are cognitive shortcuts that save on effort and save on attention. And the popular way of calling them is rules of thumb. Maybe to expand that definition just slightly for your listeners, simple rules means three things. It means simple rules are simple, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. Secondly, simple rules are unique to the person in the situation. So you may have rules for investing given your situation, and I may have different rules given my situation. And then thirdly, simple rules are focused on a particular activity. It could be choosing what to eat. It could be what to invest in. It could be how to hire. It could be which firms to partner with. But it's focused on a particular activity.
Let me give an example, a more complicated example to let you talk about for a moment, and then we'll work back to some other ideas. I can look at a situation right now. I can look at for the last in the investing world, the currency markets, interest rates. The Federal Reserve has gotten so much press in the last 5 or 6 years. Much of the work the Fed does is based off these very complicated econometric models. But we can all go back, and I don't necessarily mean this to pick on anyone, but we can look at the comments from many of the people before the crisis, and they had really no idea that there was going to be a crisis in 2008. And then the same people are involved in trying to fix it after. And it makes you wonder. It's like, well, gosh, these are some brilliant people with these fabulous models. At least we come to think that they're all fabulous models. But the results on some of the biggest things in our life, at least in markets and money, the complication doesn't seem to get us the results we need.
Yeah, that's I think a really ironic observation, and I think the idea behind simple rules is that when you have a complicated, interconnected world like the Fed overseas, if you model it with complexity, in fact, you just get models that don't predict very well, because what you're doing is essentially modeling the past. At least one of the big reasons. And so I think that may be why Janet Yellen, whether you agree with her or not, has actually comes out now with fairly simple rules. In fact, they are very simple. One of them is she's going to raise interest rates when unemployment drops below 5% and inflation goes over 2%. What is, I think, useful about that is that she has essentially simplified her own job, but also communicated to investors, to business people, and so forth, her plan of what's going to happen. And so you can do your own planning because you understand what she's going to be doing. Now, it may be that she should be changing those rules at this point, but certainly for a couple of years anyway, we've all been able to know that's the target. That's when the Fed's going to raise. So I think that's I think an illustration of both how simple rules can simplify an economy and how that simplifies an economy in the way that the rest of us can also go about our business.
You've got a great example in your work. Talk about the South Pole in around 1912.
Nobody ever asked me about that one. That's the South Pole expedition of Amundsen versus Peary. Amundsen being the Norwegian explorer and Robert Peary, the British one. What's interesting about that one is Peary had what one would have thought were all the advantages. He had Arctic experience. He had fantastic equipment. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of men. And he ends up with an expedition where he has 3 modes of transportation: dogs, ponies, and some motorized sled, none of which end up working at the end, and he ends up having to actually pull his own sled, run out of food, and so on. By contrast, Amundsen has a much simpler set of rules that are around basically focusing on traveling with dogs. And so he's very focused with a small team, using dogs pulling sled travel that he observed in the Arctic, and now he's in the Antarctic, so in the South Pole, and has a couple of simple rules about dogs, one of which is always have a lead skier because dogs want to follow someone. The second rule was stop every hour because dogs need a break, and the third was go consistent number of hours every day because dogs like to be in a rhythm. So it was really all about the dogs. And so it was a very simple set of rules. They also had some simple rules around eating and some other things, but mainly the dogs were important. In contrast, you have Peary he has dogs and he has ponies and he has other things. Plus the British pride themselves on knowing all about dogs, but they know about hunting dogs, not Arctic dogs or Antarctic dogs. So I think it's a great illustration of simplicity conquering complexity in a novel situation.
There seems to be this desire or this drive amongst a certain part of the population that complexity and there's more and more school and just really brilliant people pursuing these more and more complicated type systems. But what about the ego? Have you found something in your work, the types of people that can let go and just say, you know what? Simple's okay. I know I can't control it all. Simple will get me to where I want to go better than your complicated. Can you kind of compare and contrast the personalities that might choose simple versus not simple?
Michael, you're asking me some great questions. Nobody ever asks me this. Yeah, I think I can, actually. I think people who complicate things, there are probably 2 kinds of complicators. One are people who are risk averse. So they just want to lock everything down so there's no problem. If they plan for every contingency, they've got it covered. The problem is you can't predict the contingencies necessarily. So there's the risk averse people. There are also the people who make a living out of being complicated. So one might think of
you're being very diplomatic about that.
well, I don't want to jump on lawyers, but I think we don't need lawyers if the laws are simple, but they aren't. So I think we have lawyers, accountants, lobbyists, all make livings, particularly in the government sector, on having a complicated world that only they can decipher. So I think it's both risk aversion and making your living off it is why you see a lot of rules. By contrast, I think people who are more, let's say, simple in the right way, simple in the sense that it's not that they have no rules, but they have some. I think are people who are more risk taking and probably more strategic, because great simple rules are strategic. They aren't just. That's why your rules are not my rules. That's why, let's say, you're in your mid-30s and you have no money, your investing rules might be different than mine. If I'm in my 50s and I have a lot of wealth, I might be investing completely differently than you are and have different rules. So simple rules are strategic. And then there's the people with no rules who sort of enjoy just saying, well, we just let go with it. And they don't get much done either. So there's really three kinds of people, if you will. There's the risk-averse, make my money off it. There's the more risk-takers, strategic people. And then there's just people who just like to wing it. And the wing-it people don't do too well either. But maybe they're probably more fun to be with than the risk-averse ones.
Let me expand on your bringing up attorneys, complication. That can easily lead to a conversation about politics and something like the tax code. And I think everyone, regardless of political stripe in America, looks at the tax code and just says, what in blazes have we got here? This is what I find interesting about the simple rules concept. Everyone knows the United States of America tax code needs help. But are we ever going to get to simple rules in the tax code because of politics? Because there is an incentive for various political stripes to, and this could go both ways, to use the tax code to their advantage for political gain. And so even though someone like yourself might map out a structure, a simple rule structure that can make sense for the vast majority of people, there's a chance we might not ever get there when it comes to simple rules for the tax code.
I think you're right on all counts there. Everybody wants a simpler code, well, almost everybody, but we don't seem to be able to get there. And I think there are special interests that there are the risk-averse people who feel you have to legislate everything and legislate risk out of life, which we see something in California, basically an over-regulated state. You also see the special interests giving loopholes to various industry groups, for example, or other kinds of groups. It seems like it's not going to get simple until the Republicans and Democrats maybe start working together. And while I certainly don't think of myself as a Tea Party Freedom Caucus kind of girl, there's something to be said for their message of less government. Maybe not much to be said for their inability to compromise, but certainly that message. So if both parties could get into a sense of, let's have leaner government, save money, give it back to people, I think we'd all be better off.
There's something to be said, too, for also when an individual or a company uses simple rules, and maybe those simple rules are not intuitive at first, but to see the results from simple rules. I don't know if you have any examples that come to mind, perhaps somebody that was swayed to go to simple rules or didn't start with simple rules, and they made the transition and they have that aha moment where they all of a sudden just realize, wow, this is so much better than where we were.
Yeah, I think actually an interesting one recently is Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors. General Motors, I used to be on the General Motors Science Board, and I got a good chance to see General Motors, and it's a very complex organization, big, complicated organization, and I think she's trying to simplify it. One of her most recent attempts is looking at the GM dress code. GM dress code was 5 pages long, and sort of had a contingency for factory workers. If you were on the racetrack, wherever you were, GM specified what you should wear. She simplified that down to dress appropriately, just 2 words: dress appropriately. End of story. And I think she's a person who's trying to slash bureaucracy. Don and I have also worked with a number of companies, probably in the $100 million to $1 billion range, helping them use simple rules. So one of them was a company that was innovating in dental products, and they had an award-winning product, but they were having having difficulty selling it, in the sense they would call a bunch of dentists and they'd get maybe a 2 or 3% hit rate of dentists even wanting to talk to them. So they developed some simple rules of what an ideal dentist is. Tried those out. It was rules like an ideal dentist is 35 to 50, owns his or her own practice, is innovative. Well, it turned out those simple rules didn't work very well because it was hard to tell how old somebody was. It was hard to tell whether they own their own practice. So it was hard to implement the rules. So they they realized in the course of trying to develop rules, there were two simpler rules. One was call on dentists with innovative websites. That was a signal that you had a dentist that had the money and that had the interest in doing something cutting edge. And then the second rule was around credit scores. Check out the dentist's credit scores. So what they were trying to get was dentists who paid their bills, who were innovative. Their hit rate went up to something like 60-70%. So amazing difference. Obviously, revenue up, costs down in terms of they lower their sales costs. So that was just an example of a relatively small company with a huge impact in going to simple rules.
As the son of a dentist who's been practicing for over 45 years and still practicing and fits all the criteria that you talked about, the good things, except I keep telling him, man, your website is terrible. He's like, oh, my younger partners.
So maybe we missed your dad in those rules. I don't know. But
you can't. But the idea is you're not going to get everybody under the curve. Not everybody under the bell curve is going to be in the simple rules.
Right. But what you're going to do is you're going to massively improve your probabilities. Is the idea. So you've now made it much more likely you're calling on the right people and they want to hear your message.
You know, as a guy that grew up playing a little baseball, I love that you brought up the example with Billy Beane. Why don't you talk about the Oakland A's? It's not too far away from Stanford, a little hop, skip, and a jump. If a lot of traffic, it could take you many hours to get there. But why don't you talk about Billy Beane? And, you know, here we know a guy that, for those that have read Moneyball, very high-end statistical analysis of players and how he selects players. But he had a lot of old school scouts, and he gave those old school scouts some pretty simple rules to try and take into account everything he was thinking about. And again, it wouldn't be perfect, but why don't you talk about the simple rules he used?
Billy Beane's a great example. He's the general manager of the Oakland A's, as probably many of your listeners know. He came up with the Moneyball ideas, one of which was pick players who have high on-base percentage. And that was a break away from picking players, for example, who have high batting averages or hit a lot of home runs. He said, no, it's all about on-base percentage, not making outs. Started picking players on that basis, became successful doing that, among other simple rules, but that was a simple rule. What the movie that was the Brad Pitt movie about Billy Beane really focused in on those rules, as did the Michael Lewis book. What was not shown in either the movie or the book was the fact that Billy Beane went to simple rules, but he also increased the number of old line scouts. So what he was trying to do, I think, was more efficiently use those scouts. So give them a sandbox of here's where we're playing, and then let them use their talents to choose within that sandbox. So that's the first thing that really happens there is yes, he goes to statistics, but he also uses baseball guys who then can look at talent and don't waste their time looking at talent that basically the team's not interested in.
He had little things too, like no high school players and no kids that drink a lot.
No high school players, no kids that drink a lot were some of the rules. Another one was around pitchers who throw strikes, because base on ball is just giving the other team a free pass. What happens, though, which sometimes happens in simple rules, and it certainly happened for the Athletics, is other people started to figure out what the rules were. So you see the Boston Red Sox copying the Oakland A's rules with a bigger payroll. And they win their first World Series in, 80, 90 years, something like that, in 2004. So I think the really interesting next part of the Oakland A's story is, okay, the original rules were great, but now everybody copied them. What are the new rules? And you started to see the Oakland A's switched into new rules, for example, around platooning lefties and righties. one of their new rules, which then started to get copied again, and now they're back, I think, trying to reinvent what the rules are again. But it's kind of an interesting saga of how Billy Beane has kept reinventing the A's with new simple rules.
Since you've got so many cool examples and we're already in athletics, I should take you back to Stanford. And you've got a great example. You talk about the Stanford strength coach. Why don't you explain what happened there? I think it's a great example.
Yes, the Stanford football team, for those of you who follow football, was really miserable for a long time. The only good thing about that as a Stanford fan was it was easy to get a seat. Now it's hard because Stanford has is now ranked number 8 in the country, been a top football team for probably the last 5, 6, 7 years, 8 years maybe. And big part of that turnaround, one part was Jim Harbaugh, but the part we focus on in the book is Shannon Turley, who's the strength coach. And what Jim and Shannon realized at Stanford was it was very hard for Stanford to get players who were both Division I players who could play at Alabama and who also could get into Stanford and meet the admissions criteria. That's a very small number of people. So they realized that they had to change what strength training was about. At most schools, strength training is about being stronger, bench pressing more and lifting more. At Stanford, strength training is about staying injury-free. Apart from injury-free being the right thing to do for players, it's also the strategic thing to do for Stanford because we don't have a very deep team. And so that keeps our best players on the field and not getting hurt. So the injury rate with Stanford, with Shannon Turley's system has gone down probably 80 or 90% the number of serious injuries at Stanford. So basically our guys are healthy because of the simple rules that Shannon uses around staying injury-free and also training to play your position, not just to lift mindlessly. So he's also got a couple of rules around specific things that he does depending upon whether you're a wide receiver or not. So it's about staying injury-free and the simple rules around doing that.
I must add, since we're talking about Stanford, I've been on the campus one time, and it's an amazingly large campus. Wow.
Yeah, right.
It just takes you away. I don't know if there's a campus any bigger than that in America. It's amazing.
Well, it was the Stanford family's farm. And so it's a huge campus plus the shopping center at Stanford plus the land over where Hewlett-Packard is headquartered at Stanford. I mean, yeah, we have a massive campus.
Let's break apart a little bit more of some of the detail. And you've seen simple rules from your perspective go through several incarnations. Why don't you go ahead and briefly describe Simple Rules 1.0, 2.0, and then let's break apart 3.0 in a little more detail.
Okay, well, 1.0 was really defining what the rules were. 2 to 5 rules, unique to you, focused on an activity. The second thing we realized was there's different kinds of rules. So, for example, there are boundary rules for picking what you're going to do when you have too many alternatives. So for example, Google had hiring rules for hiring computer scientists that were rules like hire unusual people, like someone who's done something eccentric. So we started to realize there were different kinds of rules, like boundary rules.
Explain that rule for a little bit more. Hiring people eccentric. People are listening. What do they put on their resume now if they want to get hired by Google?
There's a couple things. Yeah, they wanted to serve the right schools and that sort of stuff, but to really get the people they wanted, great Googlers, it was somebody eccentric. Like you had something like you rode a unicycle, you were a stay-at-home dad for a while, you backpacked in Africa for 6 months. Things that were just different. And the idea was that you got more creative, that Google would be able to hire more creative computer scientists that way. That was a signal of creativity. The second thing they were looking for was references of other Googlers, because there the idea was Googlers know what a good Googler looks like, and they want to work with good Googlers. Therefore, they're going to pick out the right friends and refer them. And then the third thing, which maybe your listeners should know, is Google would reject you immediately if there were any kind of fudging or falsifying your resume, any little error in your resume, because Google felt that it was important to have high integrity people. So that was a way to screen out from the thousands of resumes who a smaller number of people were really going to focus on in an interview. So that was a set of rules that were around picking people which are boundary rules.
I didn't mean to interrupt because I know you were going to move to, there's priority rules, how-to rules, timing rules, exit rules. I'm going to let you talk about them all.
No, I'm not going to talk about. You want me to talk about them all?
Oh, sure,
No.
sure.
Well, I don't know about that. I'll talk about some. But there's rules for picking, and there's also how-to rules of how you're going to do whatever it is you're doing. So I think one of my favorite examples is the White Stripes, the
band.
The band. I'm not quite sure how to describe them, what adjective quite captures them, but
eccentric. Eccentric captures them. Jack White is eccentric.
Yeah, they're a pretty crazy band. But they actually have rules that they're very proud of. And when they did their hit, The White Blood Cells, they had rules like no guitar solos, no blues, no bass. So just a few rules. Within that, they did 18 songs in 10 days, had an amazing album. So that's how-to rules. Those two kinds, boundary and how-to, tend to be pretty easy for people to learn. What's hard for people to learn is rules about time, rules about rhythm or sequence that you do things. So, for example, there was one company that we worked with that had a rule about product releases. In fact, we saw this very early in our stuff. A company that we release a new product every 9 months. And what that did was it synchronized marketing, engineering, and other parts of the company that had to work together. Pixar is another example where they are on a rhythm of a movie a year. So rules about time tend to be more sophisticated and harder to learn. We also, I'll go one last kind of rule. And that's the hardest kind of rule to learn is a stopping rule. We're all good at starting things. We're not good at stopping things, whether it's selling a stock, ending a relationship, stopping a partnership, whatever. And the stopping rules are hard to learn. We worked with one company that finally came up with it. They had partnering was their key process, and they had a rule for who to pick, but they also had a rule that said if our partner's not selling our product within 3 months, the partnership's over. So the stopping rules are particularly important. Hopefully gives you a little bit of a flavor of the rules, and why the rules. I'll tell you why the rules are important. The different kinds. We first learned there's different kinds. Then we learned that some are harder to learn than others. And then we learned that some are more closely related with performance. So the harder to learn rules, like stopping, like time, tend to be even more correlated with performance than other rules, like boundary rules.
You know, it's interesting. You bring up the exit stopping. In my world, that's investing world, is pretty important. And I can think of a very well-known trader, and one of his favorite things he said to me, and he said this in public many times, the only thing I can control about the markets is how much I'm willing to lose. Every great trader, investor is really saying before they get into the market, I'm willing to lose this amount of money. What the average person doesn't understand is that is what the great trader is doing with their simple rules, whereas the average person might not necessarily think that that's the most important thing because they're more fixated on the money they can make versus the money they can lose, and they can control that with a simple rule.
Yes, that's right. I think, in fact, I'm trying to do it in my own portfolio, although it's so much easier to buy than to sell. But yeah, I know one very successful trader who's got a rule: if I lose 10% of my investment, I'm gone.
Yeah,
I sell.
Let me dig in one more little concept with you while I have you here, which we haven't talked about, which is the bottleneck. And so much of the simple rules are about getting through the bottleneck. You know, have an objective, get through the bottleneck, and then figure out these rules that really navigate the bottleneck. Why don't you talk about the bottleneck from your perspective?
The bottleneck is the middle step in the 3-step process to create simple rules. The first is the objective. What do you want more of? What do you want less of? You want more revenue, lower costs, better health, whatever it is. That's usually easy for people to do. The second step, though, is the bottleneck. The bottleneck is what's keeping you from achieving whatever that objective is. For example, an interesting case recently is Netflix and the problem that they faced when content became expensive for them and they decided to do their own content. So the objective was, how do we do our own content that becomes very successful? So successful content was their objective. The bottleneck, as I thought about the bottleneck, what traditional media sees as the bottleneck in television, using the term television loosely, is great writing. Great writing is what makes The Sopranos a great show, The Mad Men a great show. The Netflix guys said, that's not a bottleneck that will win for us because everybody else has already solved that bottleneck. They went to a different bottleneck, which was directing and programming. So directing, essentially what they did was go to A-list directors that was really very unique on television, which then created a cinematic quality for what they did. So the bottleneck is the process that keeps you from getting the objective. In the case of Netflix, it was, let's go to directing and really solve that and put simple rules around that. If it's your personal health, it might be more exercise, but then it might be more weight loss. It's really up to you, or better eating rather. If it's, to go back to the Google example of computer scientists, that really came from looking at the fact they weren't getting the innovation they wanted and realizing the problem wasn't how they organized innovation, or the bottleneck wasn't how they organized innovation. The bottleneck was who they were hiring, and then so hiring became the bottleneck. So the bottleneck requires thought, real thought of what is really keeping me from what my objective is, and then once you've got that bottleneck solved, it's then fairly straightforward to come up with the rules.
It is just a fascinating topic area to dig through. It's going to keep you busy forever.
Well, it's keeping me pretty busy. Yeah, I'm having a good time with it, and it's. I think my life's better. I think my friends' lives are better, and hopefully other people have enjoyed reading the book.
Kathleen, where can we send people? The book Simple Rules is on Amazon. It's everywhere. Where else can we send people? You get your homepage at Stanford. They can find papers, etc. Is there another page we can send it to? Another website?
You can also send them to my co-author, Donald Sull, S-U-L-L, at MIT, and of course come to my webpage at Stanford.
Kathleen, thank you for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
The closer for this 4-person episode, Emmanuel Derman. My guest today is Emmanuel Derman. He is a South African-born academic, businessman, and writer, best known as a quantitative analyst. His books include My Life as a Quant, Reflections on Physics and Finance, also Models Behaving Badly, former Goldman Sachs, Columbia professor. He has a wide range of experiences. A fun conversation, an interesting guy. I hope you enjoy. Emmanuel, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Michael?
I'm not too bad. Hey, I'm not sure if he's an acquaintance of yours or not, but a professor at Columbia was on my show recently, Alex Gracerman.
I've never met him. I know who he is.
Okay. It's a small world and a big world all at the same time, right?
Yeah. He teaches we have two sort of math finance, financial engineering programs. I think he teaches in the other one. I've often heard students mention him, but I don't think I've ever met him.
Well, listen, we can cover a lot of topics today, and I'll try and throw a lot of different things at you. And you have a lot of different views and opinions on things that are fun and interesting. And when I reached out to you, and I guess we can start with this, I reached out to you, and you were asked by a publication to give a comment on this book, Capital in the 21st Century, I believe it's called. And you didn't really offer a view on it. You took it as an opportunity to offer some feedback on economists. And I want to give a quick quote just to give a flavor of your view that was published, and I'm sure you're going to expand on it. But you talked about that the public arguments of economists often have an incestuous yet masturbatory quality that's exhausting to follow. The only field more self-confidently but just as regularly wrong as economics is nutrition. Boy, that's just laying down the gauntlet, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Although I've actually once wrote something not quite as inflammatory, but in a blog when I used to blog on Wilmot.com years ago. But I think it's true. I mean, I was careful thinking about masturbatory and incestuous, but I think it's right. It's incestuous because they're actually all very closely related to each other, and yet having a passionate relationship with each other, which is sort of a characteristic of incest. And it's masturbatory in that it never gets resolved. It's sort of fruitless. You read Paul Krugman or you read John Cochrane. They're always battling. They write the same things over and over again and never convince each other.
Before we even get into the subject of the book, which I know you stated in the article that you had not read, your point really was you didn't even want to get into the debate because you felt like the people that are the debaters, the people that are pushing forth the argument and their research, their homework behind it is not even worth the time because it's so wildly different across so many different views.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true of Piketty. I mean, I know Piketty. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. People say Piketty. I haven't read his book. I've read reviews of it. I said I don't really want to spend 600. So the trouble with a lot of books is you can condense them in one line in a way. I don't want to read it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if inequality has increased. I don't really have anything against his book. I've just got a bad feeling. I mean, economics dominates the daily newspapers and the talk shows and the op-eds so violently that I've heard other people say too, I just don't feel like reading another book. I don't think Piketty himself irritates me. It's just the class of endless argument. And it's like nutrition in the sense that they're very scathing about each other. I know I'm simplifying. They're very scathing about each other, but they're never able to convince each other.
You know, I saw you make a comment in an interview. You said something to the effect of engineering, chemistry can be value free. It is what it is. Economics, I saw you define as, we might as well be calling it a moral science. Why don't you explain your thought process there?
Yeah, I like that. I think, economics, I've never studied economics in my life. I'm a novice. I went to school in South Africa, which is like a British system where you major in whatever you're going to major right away, undergraduate. So I did sciences from the age of 16 and a half. I learned finance on the job when I came to Goldman Sachs in 1985. Somebody gave me the Black-Scholes, actually the Cox-Ross-Rubenstein and Black-Scholes model to read, and then threw me in feet first. So I come late to economics. But in my youth, people who studied economics, they did PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. And if you look at Black-Scholes, I think it's originally published in the Journal of Political Economy or something like that. And economics wasn't always so mathematical. It was, I don't have my Guardian article about Piketty in front of me, but I said something like, economics is about how to spend limited resources to achieve what people think is worthwhile achieving, and that's a kind of moral decision. It's not a mathematical decision. The mathematics is a technique, but it takes some bigger view of the world and some agreement to decide, or maybe disagreement in the end, about what's actually worth doing. Am I answering your question? I'm not sure.
Well, and I think what you're really getting at too is that economics is it's being positioned as something that it's not. There's always going to be a human or a moral element, as you say. It's not just a formula that you let run. If it was, there wouldn't be such a massive disagreement out there.
Right. I can't put it better than that. But that's sort of actually not from Piketty and not from Darren Asimoglu, whom I actually met. I gave a talk somewhere in Germany about a month ago, and he gave a talk on what makes nations fail. And that's sort of, as best as I could understand, in the more classical economic framework, although he told me that he actually started out as a very mathematical economist and you sort of had to do that.
When you decided to give the opinion on the Piketty work, were you in the back of your mind also sharing or having a belief on his basic premise?
I don't question his basic premise, but just intuitively, I think it's probably likely. It's likely to be true. I was really, in some sense, I was just ranting against the state of economic discourse and using him as a crutch. I haven't read his book, as I said in that article, and I suspect what he says is right. But he became, I don't know, every few months or every few years, there's this craze about some book, and he was the current one. I think I tweeted one day, I can't remember what was before that. At one point, it was Michael Lewis's book. Which I actually did read. Forget what it's called now. Do you know which one I mean? The last one.
Yeah, I get a kick how you think about this stuff. I sometimes feel the same way, is that there's so much information, you take it in, and sometimes books, and I even look at some of my books like this, sometimes it's really one great idea is all it is,
Yes. If you don't want to read, a lot of books can be summarized in a short space. Let me take
you back a few years. I think you have some opinions on this subject as well. And I still talk to people about it. It's still, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but it still bothers me to this day that all 4 of the U.S. investment banks were not allowed to go by the wayside.
Yeah, I'm horrified at what happened. I argue a lot with friends what happened in the bailout, in the sense that if capitalism is going to make sense for anybody, it's a brutal business, but the idea is you pay your money or you make your bets and you take the results. And that didn't happen. We bailed out. Who are you talking about specifically?
Well, I mean, we went down the line. Bayer disappeared, and Lehman Brothers disappeared, and then we got to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and they kind of said the line in the sand. Yeah,
they were about to disappear. I actually went to a sort of ex-Goldman People's Party shortly after that, and people were saying that they were really scared that weekend. They were planning. They were expecting the end. And I think the Fed or the Treasury went in and made them a bank holding company and literally saved their bacon. People say, and I think it's right, that they didn't own junk the way maybe Merrill or eventually Bank of America did. But still, even if you go down for systemic reasons, as opposed to your bad decisions, that's still one of the risks that you knew about and took. Mm. And I don't think you deserve to be saved, and not at public expense.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty straightforward opinion. I happen to share it. I think a lot of other wise people share it as well, too. Let me get you to go back in time, though. So ultimately, you get your PhD in theoretical physics. You had that before you started at Goldman?
Oh, yeah. I have a roundabout route. I got a PhD in 1973. And actually, unlike a lot of the physicists on Wall Street, I actually worked for 7 years afterwards as a physicist doing research. So from 73 to 80, I was a postdoc in various places in University of Pennsylvania, and then in Oxford, and then at Rockefeller University in New York. And then I was an assistant professor. Am I getting too long-winded here?
No, not at all.
Okay, then I was assistant professor at University of Colorado at Boulder, which was a very nice place. But my wife was in academic life too, in biology, and we were always moving in different places. And we had a small kid already. My son was born in England. And I sort of threw the towel in. I got kind of tired of the whole thing. It was getting too hard to find a job where you wanted. And I was getting a bit disillusioned in general. So I went to work at Bell Labs, which was what Wall Street is now was for physicists. In 1980, Bell Labs, and actually the energy industry, Exxon labs were the places where technical people went when they couldn't get university jobs anymore. So I went there for 5 years, and then I came to Goldman in 1985.
So now you would have been at the front line of physicists being hired onto Wall Street. I mean, you were right there at the beginning stages of that.
Close to the beginning, but not absolutely. I interviewed in '83 when I was at Bell Labs. I came away at Goldman, and I didn't take a job. And then 2 years later, I kind of had enough, and I did. But there were people there already, I would say, from the very late 70s or early 80s in a small amount.
By the time, having been at Bell Labs and then going to Goldman, you were well aware of what Goldman was. You were not kind of just new to the idea of Wall Street and whatnot. You're like, okay, I know how my experience can benefit myself going to this investment bank. You knew as you were taking that position. It wasn't, I've talked to some folks that actually have gone in with your type of background and they really were like, well, just tell me that I didn't know anything.
I wasn't as knowledgeable as you say. I was at Bell Labs for 5 years in what they called a business analysis system center or business systems analysis center. I can't quite remember. It was sort of it was a lot of ex-scientists already doing other stuff, mostly computerish. But I didn't know that much about Wall Street. I learned a little bit of finance. They sent me once to an MIT sort of exec ed course for 2 weeks, where I learned a little bit about the capital asset pricing model, but didn't really understand it. I went to Wall Street more because I'd had it with Bell Labs. And I was sitting there the whole time for several years thinking, should I try to go back to physics academic life, which was really hard because I wanted to stay in New York. And I wasn't even sure if I could get a job, and I would sort of had to go back a bunch of career steps, or jump all the way out of the ivory tower, which Bell Labs was partially, and go to Wall Street. And you were getting lots of calls from Wall Street headhunters in those days. They were fishing, dropping their bait in Bell Labs, and eventually I gave in. Not sure what I was in for, really.
Well, that's kind of where I was going to go. So you have an idea of what Goldman Sachs is and perhaps how your skills might be used. And then you get there. What were some of the feelings, experiences that you can talk about early on that perhaps were the real eye opener about what you were in the middle of?
Yeah, it was actually, I almost feel a little bad saying it, but it was actually quite wonderful because I felt like a real trader leaving physics in 1980 and leaving things that I liked. And Bell Labs, I was kind of unhappy for 5 years, almost from the moment I got there. Maybe I'd been unhappy anywhere I would have gone after being in physics, but Bell Labs was the place, and it was very bureaucratic. It was part of AT&T. They had 1 million people. There were literally a staff of 1 million people. There was an incredible bureaucracy in which, every 4 members of technical staff worked for a supervisor. Every 4 supervisors worked for a department head. Every 4 department heads worked for whatever it was. And everybody was asking permission all the time for everything. And coming from physics, I was used to sort of thinking, I'm going to live or die by my own skill, and not be part of a big bureaucracy. And so when I came to Goldman, this is in 1985, there were maybe 5 or 6 or 7,000 people there. It was large already, but nothing like now. It was actually very entrepreneurial in a good way. I was doing research. I wasn't really a market person. I wasn't a trader. I wasn't a salesman. They had a very intellectual environment, at least for people like me. And in addition, unlike at Bell Labs, maybe this sounds counterintuitive, but at Bell Labs, I always had the feeling that everybody wanted to be a supervisor and they were going to climb over your back to become one. And what people really respected, except for a few isolated counterexamples, what people respected was the ability to be a manager. And when I came to Goldman, if you were a geek, if you were a programmer, if you could solve differential equations, you might be sort of a little weird, but you got paid not badly, and people kind of respected you. So it was actually, I got very excited coming there. I got a real shot in the arm. I write in my book that I used to go up and down on the subway to work reading Cox and Rubenstein on options markets and feeling like I had something to learn and something to contribute.
Well, let's break apart, one of your great lines, My Life as a Quant, the title of your book too. Why don't you break apart model building and your model building at Goldman Sachs, the good and bad of it? Pick a way to kind of let the audience, look, some of my audience is inexperienced, some of them are very experienced, and perhaps your peers, but why don't you just describe the idea of model building and how you were indoctrinated to model building and the types of models that you were building?
That is a big question. I'm trying to think how to work my way into it. But I came there, and as I said, the first thing somebody did was throw Cox-Ross Rubenstein model, binomial model at me, asked me to read it, and then start fixing a program that didn't work, that had some errors in it. Well, first of all, I'm trying to think. First of all, I worked very closely with traders. The research group I was in worked very closely with traders who actually used these models. So I liked it because it was a bit like being a theoretical physicist where you work closely with experimentalists, which is what I had done in my previous life, the traders being the experimentalists.
You could apply it right there.
Yeah, it was very nice because God knows if it's ethically justifiable. I ran into people who cursed me at the time when I said I was working on Wall Street, but you actually worked on a model. And it was iterative, and there was lots of interaction. You started doing something, a trader would try it, they would give you some feedback. They knew what the actual financial problem was better than you did. So that part was very exciting. It was like a collaboration between people using it and people trying to understand how to make something that would work for them. They understood the markets, you understood the math better, and maybe the modeling. One of the things that became very clear to me at the time and was that user interface was very important. I had a background from Bell Labs in building user interfaces and building not just Fortran programs, but real Unix sort of trading systems. And one of the things that became very clear to me was that what mattered a lot for a model was not just the extra math or the extra finance or the extra computer science or statistics. It was an interdisciplinary mix of all of those, but that the ergonomics was very important. The first thing I did was replace a very old-fashioned model that didn't have a screen at all, and you had to enter all the data line by line in a question and answer way. This was a long time ago in 1985. And I built from scratch. I knew how to do it. There were no spreadsheets in those days. I built a screen that moved the cursor around and asked the user, enter the coupon, enter the maturity date, enter the option expiration, maturity date for the bond, and then saved all that information so that if he came back the next day, he could look at the same trade and try to analyze it again if they hadn't done it yet. And I suddenly realized how important the software environment is in addition to the model. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I just, sometimes it's just you just want to get inside folks' minds, have them relay some experiences. I think that's what the audience enjoys. The audience enjoys just hearing people, how they walked their path. So there's nothing you're going to say that's going to be boring. You've had an interesting career. You know that.
Okay. I like the mix of theory and software, and I think it was very important. And actually, when I ran groups later, I didn't like to separate the so-called information technology part from the quantitative financial part. I liked one person who could do both of those, and that's the way I grew up, doing my own dirty work. That's the way I sort of lived for most of the time I was on Wall Street. And these things go in phases, actually. Then somewhere around the late 90s, that changed, and the IT people and the quant people became separate, the thinkers and the developers. But I think it's gone the other way again now with algorithmic trading and trading systems. There's been a unification of those skills in one person again. And I think that's good. It makes for a much more interesting life as well.
I start this conversation off letting you compare economics to perhaps other sciences. One of the things that you've also done, though, too, is compare finance models to physics models. And look, I could think of people in my world having written some books about the style of trading called trend following, and many of these traders today, and I understand why they do it, and it makes perfect sense to me, are coming at in their public and private announcements from a scientific method standpoint. They're describing their methods in science terms. I can think of two traders, one running about a $25 billion fund and one running about a $5 billion fund. Combined, they got pretty good money. They're unrelated, but the reason I bring it up is that Goldman Sachs owns 10% of each of them. And so I'm curious if you would break apart, because I've got some other points here, but why don't you break apart big picture wise the notion of the financial model and science and just the physics model and science?
I like to say that finance and physics have the same syntax, but not the same semantics. In that, if you look at a finance paper and a physics paper, the finance paper looks much more formal than most physics papers these days. Everybody in economics writes, I can talk about that later, writes in the strange mathematical axiomatic style. But the semantics is different. Even though they both use maths and you might naively confuse one for the other, it's very different. In physics, you actually have equations that accurately describe the world to a very high degree of accuracy and predict the future. And most financial models don't predict the future. That's not the way people in the trading world use them. They usually take a model and calibrate it to liquid current prices and then use it to estimate in the present the value of less liquid things. People really predict the future. They rather try to figure out what illiquid things are worth given the price of liquid things. That's what Black-Scholes really does for you. It tells you if you know the price of a short-term bond, interest rates, in other words, and if you know the price of a stock, it'll tell you roughly what the price of an option should be. So it's always going from the present to the present, not from the present to the future. So that's one big semantic difference. Secondly, it just doesn't work as well. A lot of finance is really glorified interpolation. That's not an insult. It's just a fact. In the way that I described, you're trying to go from liquid known fungible prices to illiquid values and estimate them. That doesn't work badly as long as the world stays in the same sort of state as you're in when you calibrated the model. But when trouble comes, all bets are off. Your models don't really work. I kind of like to say that all financial models, at least of the kind that I worked on, are really short volatility in the sense that when volatility increases, they're going to do badly.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I was thinking about, for example, Nassim Taleb and Mark Spitznagel, and thinking about the trend following world, my world. It's a lot of long volatility. When you think about models, though, is it your experience, the short volatility models is where you really have the issue, or do you also look at the long volatility models and say, I've got some concerns there as well?
No, I was actually talking. Well, I think both. I was just saying, in a way, that whether you build long vol models or Taleb, I'm stepping aside, Taleb and Spitznagel, I think, are less building models than just saying it would be smart to be long volatility, not short volatility, because when trouble comes, you'll make money if you own out of the money options. I think they're not really building structural models in the sense that, say, Black-Scholes is or something like that. But what I was trying to say is, if you're a long vol, or if you're a trend follower, that's good as long as the world stays fairly calm. But hidden inside there in the market, there's something that's making you short vol, because if you get a big increase in volatility, your model is probably going to be wrong. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no. I'm just thinking from a trend following perspective, changes in volatility. Look, nobody can predict the future. And I think it's how I'm very interested in your view of finance models compared to physics models. And I guess I was just curious the types of models that you were specifically thinking of when you started to go down this comparison between the two.
I was thinking of CAPM, efficient markets, Black-Scholes, almost any of the models that I face every day, although I mostly come from a derivatives world, not from at least when I worked on Wall Street, not from an asset management world.
But the big issue for you ultimately, and if we just break this down to simple terms, how does one estimate risk?
Yeah, I think I'm trying. Let me go back to what I was saying before,
sure.
And then I'll come back to that. But in physics, for some wonderful reason, okay. In this book I wrote called Models Behaving Badly, I tried hard to distinguish epistemologically somehow between the idea of a theory and a model. And I said theories are things that really try to describe the world the way it is. So, for example, in Newton's laws, you say force equals mass times acceleration, and there's nothing relative about that. You say that's the way the world is. You may be right, you may be wrong, but that's what Newton says. And so physics has two classes of attempts to understand the natural world. One is theories, where they say something like force equals mass times acceleration, which is just a statement about the way somebody thinks the world works, and it actually does. And then the other one so that's an absolute model, an absolute statement, and I call that a theory. And a model is more of an analogy, where you say the nucleus is like a liquid drop of water. That's not an absolute statement, that's a relative statement. What you're saying is, for example, you can think of the nucleus of an atom as a vibrating, rotating drop of water. And somebody actually got the Nobel Prize for that model because it works pretty well. But everybody in physics understands that saying the nucleus, it's called the liquid drop model of the nucleus. Everybody in physics understands that that's a model, but that Newton's laws are a theory. And what makes it a model is that it's making a comparison between something you understand and something you don't. I don't think finance has any theories. If you look at efficient market models or Black-Scholes, finance models are saying stock prices behave like smoke diffusing, or like Brownian motion, like dust particles bumping around, being bumped by atoms in a room. And those are analogies, and they're insightful, but they're not true. They're not true in the way that Newton's laws are true. So they break down at some point. And I don't think finance has any real absolute theories that are correct. So, for example, coming back to what you said about risk, at least the traditional sort of modern portfolio theory measures risk as the standard deviation of returns. And that would be the real risk if stocks really did behave like particles of dust being bumped around under Brownian motion, but they don't. It's not a bad model. It's not a bad analogy to give you a feel for what things are like, but it's actually not true. No, I think that's the big difference between physics and finance, is that physics somehow has this ability, because it's dealing with inanimate objects, to write down something that works pretty well, and finance can really only make analogies that ultimately fail.
Right now, at this point of your career, you're in the academic community again. So, those are pretty strong statements. Do you find a significant amount of pushback from others in the academic community when you say things so bluntly as you just did? Or do they kind of go, "Oh shit, don't say that," because we know it's true, but
that's an interesting question. I mean, I think people who work on Wall Street on trading desks agree with what I'm saying, and I've heard people say similar stuff. I worked for Bob Lutzenberger at one point, and he certainly felt similarly. I think everybody understands that on Wall Street, and good traders understand that, and I think people at Goldman understand that, which is why they didn't lose a lot of money. They maybe should have gone down because the whole system was going to go down, but they didn't go down out of buying bad securities. But academics most of the academics I've met have a very bad mental model of the way people use models, and I think they don't understand what I was saying. They tend to teach economics and finance in a very mathematical way with axioms and theorems and lemmas, and don't really worry about whether that's true or not. They don't understand how sloppily but intelligently people use models in a trading environment.
It struck me, not having your background, but looking at a lot of different white papers, and sometimes some of them I just kind of glaze over. But you've made the comment, the idea that, finance papers often these days clearly look like science papers. And I saw you make the comment that it's almost a perversion of common sense. That's, it's the idea of human behavior being put into these formulas that resemble physics formulas is kind of maybe fooling ourselves, isn't it?
I think if you want to work in this field intelligently, you have to be a little bit schizophrenic. You can't avoid using mathematics, but you have to keep looking over your shoulder all the time and saying, I know this isn't really right. And I know it's going to break down because I'm describing people and markets which are driven by people, and they don't really work this way except for a small period of time or in a small range of environments which may change at any instant. So I think you have to sort of keep being suspicious about everything you do, which I think academics don't do. They have this, I'm talking blanket terms, but they have this idea that you can write down something and just keep going, and that the world actually works that way. And if your model doesn't work, they somehow think somewhere out there is a holy grail model and we're getting closer and closer to it. But I don't think that's the case at all, because the environment in which you use the models keeps changing, and even using a new model changes the environment, and you don't really get closer and closer to this. In physics, maybe you get closer and closer to the grand theory of everything. Maybe you don't, but at least you could plausibly argue that you do. But I think it's a mistake to think that way in finance.
When you talk to your students and you're talking about quantitative models, you want them to be able to explain them qualitatively as well, too, huh?
Yes, I do. I think and I think that's something, I learned that in physics, but I learned it at Goldman too, that if you want to communicate with people who use these models but aren't as numerate as you are, it's very important to understand the model from an intuitive point of view, or from a visceral point of view. You don't just want to do a calculation and say this is the answer. You want to understand, preferably in advance, what the answer might look like and what are the important parts that enter. And that's when you really learn a lot. And I think that's, to some extent, the benefit of getting a PhD, which in itself doesn't mean that much. But I think, at least in physics, when you get a PhD, you have to go through a lot of hard struggle to not just derive equations, but understand what they mean in a qualitative way. And anyway, I try to impress that on the students, and they do it, but it's a hard job.
I was going to say, for some very bright teenage students, very bright math aptitudes, trying to explain to them why they need to spend their time also proving this qualitatively is probably sometimes they might look at you and go, why?
There are, finance, you can be a math genius at age 18, or you can be a chess genius at age 16 or 17 or 18. I think you can't be a physics genius that early, and you can't be a finance genius that early. It takes a lot more understanding of the world than just playing chess.
Yeah, fair point. Listen, Emmanuel, I appreciate you coming on today. I just want to have a quick chat. I know you had some interesting perspectives. I'm up to close to 300 podcast episodes. And like I said, I'm sure many of the folks I've had on have been your peers, but I thought you had some really very strong, clear views about economics, finance, and a science such as physics, and kind of comparing and contrasting all three. And I think it's good food for thought for people just to stay grounded and keep their eyes wide open. As you say, keep looking behind you as well, too, and keep worrying and being a little skeptical that there could be a breakdown. Things might not go the way you expect, might not go the way that the formula dictates.
I think physics and finance are very different. I said before, they use the same language and they use some of the same skills, but the meaning of what they do is very different.
Yeah.
But I'm a bit sad about the way economics has gotten so mathematical, and even finance. It's gotten much more mathematical than physics in a way. People in physics, I said this in my book, but you write down equations and sometimes they're tremendously efficacious, even if you're not very formal, in the sense they really do explain things. And in finance, you can't get published these days unless you write very mathematical papers, and often they have no efficacy at all.
I mean, that's got to be shocking for quite a few people to hear. I mean, you've got, it's not like you're a new guy on the block and you're just basically saying that, if I get back to your original descriptor that I pulled from that article, you basically just described a good portion of the field that are writing these finance papers as publishing mental masturbation. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like what you're saying.
It's all exaggerated a little bit. It doesn't apply to everybody, but I think it's true. And then the counterexample to that is behavioral economics. And I once wrote a column for a German newspaper. I'm kind of disappointed in behavioral economics too. I got very excited when I first started to learn about it, because it seemed like what Kahneman and Tversky were going to do, and what did set out to do, although I learned it much later, was to explain people's anomalous, mistaken intuitions about risk in a mathematical way. So they don't like losses. They're willing to do anything to cover their losses, even irrationally. And they try to describe all this in prospect theory. And it looked really the right way to go, to try to sort of build the mathematics of the way people actually behave rather than the way efficient markets assume. But I think it's gotten kind of perverted. When I look at behavioral finance now too, a lot of the articles are about gender issues in CEOs. If I Googled for a minute, I would find my article that I wrote. But if you look at the SSRN newsletter of behavioral economics, so many of the articles are about, whether stock markets do worse the day after they lose a game in the World Cup.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I'm not making these things up. Or CEOs' gender studies, or small market anomalies. They're sort of mildly interesting, but you get the feeling that they don't amount to a whole discipline in the way that classical economics did, or even efficient markets, and that people are sort of just digging around for things to publish. Doing something similar to what somebody else did before in a slightly different case so they can have an article.
It's a great point. I sometimes look at behavioral economics and finance and I say, well, gosh, it's like grasping for straws to come up with an example for this particular week, month, or year. Whereas maybe the original guys, as you mentioned, had some innovative and novel thought. But today it does seem like people are reaching.
Yeah. I mean, classical, or whatever you call it, classical portfolio theory or efficient market, it's not strictly correct, but there's something comprehensive and attractive about it. And behavioral economics started out that way too, but I think it's gone astray. And it's gone astray in another way too, in that it's become a political tool, in the sense that the people who are using so-called behavioral economics a lot are really politicians. Yeah, Richard Thaler, I believe, was head of behavioral economists for Obama. They're trying to, so the people who are using it are advertisers and politicians or political manipulators, both in the business of manipulation, trying to portray politicians to you depending on what you clicked on last, trying to show you that part of the politician that would appeal to you if you're that kind of person. Am I making sense? So they look at your profile on the web and if you're one kind of person, they'll show you one side of the political person they want you to vote for candidate. If you're on another, if you've clicked on other things, they'll show you something different. And I don't think that's a great way to run a democracy. I was sort of used to growing up in South Africa where there were big issues and you look to politicians to lead you rather than to follow. Now they seem to want to figure out what is it you want and then I'll pretend to be that, as opposed to people like Obama or actually Gorbachev or de Klerk who got one step ahead of history by trying to figure out how to get to a non-violent solution rather than trying to figure out what people want and say, I'll give it to you. I'll pretend to give it to you.
Yeah, but I think you probably, I guess if we really were to get scientific about politicians, we could probably all argue, regardless of political stripe, left, right, center, they all kind of work from the same playbook.
Yeah, I wasn't criticizing one particular, I wasn't criticizing one particular one. I was sort of more saying there's a style of politics now which is to sort of lead from behind rather than from in front.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all about polling and what is your particular view, as you mentioned, and just trying to deliver the flavor of the week and make somebody happy for that moment in time. But there's very little of that stand up, this is the right direction, this is the way we need to go. Look, a great example, I know you're probably up in the New York area. I mean, would we ever build the Brooklyn Bridge today? Of course not.
Oh my God, that's so depressing. I live in Manhattan, and I remember when the West Side Highway fell down when I still worked at Bell Labs, and I had to drive that way every day in the 80s. And nobody's ever rebuilt it,
Yeah, I mean, you can't. There's getting things done has become so protracted, and that's a whole different subject. We could go on there, but listen, I appreciate you coming on because you've got a really wide perspective, and I think it's fun to kind of take these different disciplines, connect them together, contrast them, kind of pull them apart, and you've seen it and lived it. So I appreciate you coming on today. Hey, where's the best place? People can check out your books on Amazon, but your best website to send people to, where should we send them to?
I have a website called www.emmanueldurman.com, which has a lot of the stuff, not easily accessible, but it's all there. I want to clean it up. I have these two books, Models Behaving Badly, which is the later one, and My Life as a Quant, which are both available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble as ebooks or as hardcover. And I actually wrote a lot of, I actually have, if somebody's interested, I wrote a lot of columns for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung at one point for about a year and a half related to some of these things. And I've got them all in an ebook together with some short stories called Bad Behavior on Amazon. And it's got a lot of general sort of short articles about this kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, absolutely. People can go grab your books and dig a little bit deeper on some of your life experiences. We can only touch on so much in 45 minutes. And it's our first time talking. So sometimes if you get some slightly crazy guy calling you from Asia, peppering you with questions, you got to kind of stop and pause for a second and say, where do I want to take this? Yeah, I understand the feeling.
No, I enjoyed this. I didn't know much about it before, but it was very interesting.
Hey, Emmanuel, thanks again. And hopefully maybe we can catch up again in the near future. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.